Hello, literature lovers. Welcome to Literary Journeys with River. Today, we bring you an exciting summary of Crown of Midnight, the second book in Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass series. Remember, this is just a summary, not the full book, so if you want to dive into all the details, be sure to read the book. Let's plunge into this story full of intrigue, action, and magic. First part, The King's Champion. Chapter 1. The storm battered the coast with such fury that it concealed any trace of activity at the mansion. It was amidst this chaos that the King's Champion made her stealthy entrance. She scaled the garden wall and climbed to the second floor, aided by the roaring wind and thunder that masked her movements. No one saw or heard her. Once inside, she hid in the shadows as she heard approaching footsteps. A maid, unaware of her presence, closed the open window and left without noticing the wet footprints on the floor. With her heart racing, the assassin waited in the dimness, allowing another flash of lightning to briefly illuminate the hallway as she recalled the plan she had memorized during days of surveillance. The mansion remained in tense silence, broken only by the storm outside. With calculated steps, she headed towards Lord Nyral's chamber. She knew her target was behind the third door on the left. She entered without a sound and closed the door behind her in sync with a thunderclap. A flash of light illuminated the room, revealing Lord Nyral, a man in his mid-30s, sleeping beside his beautiful wife. The question of what this couple had done to deserve death briefly crossed her mind, but it was not her place to question the king's orders. Her mission was clear, and her freedom depended on fulfilling it. She approached the bed, the weight of her task pressing on her shoulders. She unsheathed her sword with almost ghostly precision, preparing for what was to come. In the last second, just as the blade rose above her head, Lord Nyral opened his eyes, coming face to face with death. Chapter 2. Celaena Sardothien walked through the crystal castle of Rifthold, moving with firmness and determination. In her hand was a heavy sack that swung with each step, brushing against her knees. Though the hood of her cloak covered her face, the guards did not stop her. They knew well who she was and whom she served. As the king's champion, her rank was above most in the castle, and almost everyone feared her. When she reached the crystal doors of the council chamber, the guards straightened at the sight of her, allowing her to pass. Inside, the king of Adarlan awaited her, seated on his imposing crystal throne, and beside him were Dorian Haviliard and Cale Westfall, the captain of the guard. The king's gaze fell on the sack Celaena carried, recognizing its contents. With a submissive gesture, the assassin knelt before him, while Dorian watched her with piercing eyes and Cale maintained his usual impassive expression. The king urged her to rise, and as she did, Celaena removed her hood, revealing her face. With a simple question, the king asked for confirmation that her mission had been accomplished. Without hesitation, the champion opened the sack and dropped a severed head at the monarch's feet. The battered face of Lord Nyral rolled across the marble floor, stopping in front of the throne. Dorian looked away, shocked, while Cale kept his eyes on her. The champion added that her target had resisted. The king examined the head, notably disfigured, and expressed satisfaction with her work. However, the mission did not end there. The king informed her of an impending uprising in Rifthold, orchestrated by a group determined to overthrow him. Her new task was to eliminate the leaders before they became a real threat. The first name on the list was Archer Finn, a courtier Celaena had known for years. Controlling her surprise, she accepted the mission, knowing she had a month to complete it. After receiving her instructions, Celaena headed to the castle sewers, with Cale closely following. Once there, they exchanged a few words, with Cale expressing concern for her safety and Celaena masking any trace of vulnerability. Finally, She threw the sack into the water, watching as it slowly sank into the filthy canal. Back in her quarters, after a necessary bath and tending to her loyal cat, Fleetfoot, Celaena reflected on the mission she had just completed. She knew she had deceived the king and everyone around her, for in reality, she had not killed Lord Neral or his wife. Instead, she had offered her targets the chance to flee and start anew in exchange for faking their deaths. But now, with Archer Finn as her next target, the situation was becoming more dangerous. She knew Archer well and didn't believe he was a traitor, but the fact that his name was on the king's list indicated that something darker was at play. As she stroked the protective amulet hanging from her neck, Celaena knew she was playing a risky game. If the king discovered what she was really doing, she would be in mortal danger. But for now, her priority was to uncover the truth about Archer and maintain her facade of loyalty to the king. Because if her deception failed, there would be no possible escape. Chapter 3. Celaena was running through a dark secret passage, feeling Kane's breath on her neck. Despite her speed, she couldn't shake him off. Kane followed her like a shadow, leaving strange, glowing green symbols that lit up the ancient walls. Behind him, the Ritterak, a monstrous creature with long claws, lumbered heavily after her, and though Celaena tried to keep her footing, she felt the ground beneath her becoming muddy and treacherous. She knew she couldn't escape, that sooner or later they would catch her, and when they did, the Ritterak would devour her mercilessly. Kane, relishing in her terror, whispered her true name into her ear, and she screamed as she awoke with a start, sweaty and with her heart racing, clutching the amulet hanging from her neck, the Eye of Elena. She forced herself to scan the darkness of her bedroom, searching for any sign of danger, but found only the flicker of the dying fire in the hearth. It was just a nightmare, she repeated to herself, but the terror was so real that she struggled to convince herself. Fleetfoot, her dog, snuggled up beside her, giving her a sense of comfort. Celaena closed her eyes again, trying to convince herself that it was all over. At dawn, Celaena went to the nearby nature park, where the cold mist covered the pale grass. She threw a stick into the distance, and Fleetfoot, with her boundless energy, raced after it, glowing like a golden streak in the chilly morning. Beside her, Nehemia watched the scene with a mix of admiration and mockery. The princess, busy with her own affairs and efforts to win the queen's trust, usually met with Celaena at dawn, the only time of day they could talk in private. As Fleetfoot returned with the stick, Nehemia, with her inquisitive tone, asked about Archer Finn, the target of Celaena's new mission. The assassin explained that the king believed Archer was involved in a conspiracy to overthrow him, a rebel movement in Rifthold. Nehemia, incredulous, questioned the logic of such a claim. The idea of a rebel movement in Rifthold seemed absurd to her, as the city was a death trap for rebels who preferred to hide in mountains and forests. But Celaena insisted that the king had a list of key people in the supposed rebellion, and that she was to eliminate them one by one. The idea made the princess pale, who asked if Celaena would have to kill them all. Celaena's affirmative answer, though firm, still worried Nehemia. The dialogue between the two became more tense when Nehemia revealed that she had tried, unsuccessfully, to negotiate better conditions for the prisoners in Calaculla, the labor camp in Islwi, with the king. The situation in the camp was worsening every day, with more rebels being sent there, and the conditions were terrible. Nehemia confessed to Celaena her desire to do something for her people, to take action, a thought that deeply worried Celaena. However, Celaena couldn't promise anything. She knew that any wrong move could endanger not only herself but also Kale, Nehemia, and many others. Nehemia, disappointed by her friend's lack of commitment, stormed off, leaving Celaena alone in the park. The assassin stood gazing into the distance, thinking about her next meeting with Cale and the questions she wanted to ask Archer Finn. But before facing Archer, she had other plans in mind: to get out of that castle, even if only for a few hours, and spend some of the money she had earned with her dark occupation. Chapter 4. Cale Westfall ran alongside Celaena through the castle's nature park, feeling the icy air pierce his lungs like crystal. Despite the light coats they wore, the cold was relentless, and though sweat soaked their bodies, both were freezing. Celaena, with a red nose and flushed cheeks, smiled at him with a spark in her eyes, teasing him about his endurance. With a challenging tone, Celaena insinuated that Cale was tired, but he defended himself, saying he had had to slow down so as not to leave her behind. In reality, the young woman followed him effortlessly, graceful and agile as a deer in the forest. However, Cale felt that something inside him had changed. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to part from her when she went on her missions. He worried that one day she wouldn't return, especially after everything they had been through together. As they ran, the memory of Cain, whom Cale had killed to save Celaena, overwhelmed him. Though he knew he had done it for a good cause, the feeling of guilt wouldn't leave him. Celaena noticed his discomfort and confronted him, realizing that the captain was thinking about Cain. Though Cale tried to deflect the conversation, Celaena spoke to him sincerely about the deaths she had caused and how those experiences had marked her. She reminded him that killing Cain had not been a dishonorable act and that she would never forget that Cale had saved her. Cale, feeling comforted by her words, stepped back, aware of the barrier that separated them. He knew that crossing that line could be dangerous for both of them, especially considering his loyalty to the king and his friendship with Dorian. Though his feelings for Celaena were deep, Cale decided to keep his distance. The training ended with both exhausted, heading to the castle in search of warmth and a good breakfast. As they walked along the path, Cale noticed how the young ladies of the castle gathered to watch him, something Celaena couldn't help but comment on with irony. Cale, however, seemed oblivious to the stir he caused. As they conversed, Dorian appeared accompanied by a blonde young man Celaena didn't recognize. The young man was Roland Havillard, Dorian's cousin, newly arrived at the castle to join the king's council. Roland, with his courtly smile, aroused Celaena's suspicion, who preferred to avoid his company. After a brief exchange, in which Roland hinted at a possible interest in working with Celaena, Cale led her out of the situation, taking her into the castle. Later, after returning from her shopping, Celaena met Dorian in her quarters. The prince, with his usual charming smile, tried to regain the closeness they had lost, but Celaena, though aware of the mutual attraction, decided to keep her distance, remembering the dangers they faced if they allowed their feelings to intensify. After a tense conversation, Dorian left, leaving her alone, frustrated and irritated. Chapter 5. Celaena crouched on the roof of an elegant mansion in Rifthold, shielding herself from the icy wind blowing from the Avery River. She had spent hours spying on Archer Finn, who was on a date that had lasted much longer than expected. The house she was watching belonged to Lady Balanchine, but beyond the name, Celaena hadn't been able to find out much about her or her connections. Using her usual trick of posing as a messenger, she had managed to gather some information about the other houses Archer visited, but nothing significant. As night fell, the cold grew more intense, and Celaena began to feel it in her bones. It had been so long since she had stalked someone on the rooftops of Rifthold, and the familiarity of the situation transported her back to days gone by. Days when Sam Cortland was by her side and her life in the assassin's fortress hadn't yet fallen apart. Finally, the mansion's door opened and Archer appeared, descending the stairs with his typical elegance. Celaena watched as he got into a carriage and, without wasting a second, descended from the roof and followed him, hiding in the shadows of the cobbled streets of the city. Though the traffic slowed the carriage down, Celaena kept her distance, wondering if she would discover something that would change her perception of Archer and the supposed rebel conspiracy. The weight of her past and the scars left by Sam were still present, and the possibility of facing a new truth unsettled her. Back at the castle, Celaena found herself in Cale's room, enjoying the warmth of the fire while reviewing her notes on Archer. Cale, who was lying on the floor working, couldn't help but tease her for falling asleep while trying to study the case. The captain's room, though more austere than Celaena's suite, was cozy, and in recent weeks it had become a refuge for her. Despite her complaints, Cale had never asked her to leave, not even when she appeared at ungodly hours. As Celaena reviewed a map of the city, her thoughts drifted to a specific place, a street she had deliberately avoided. It was a place loaded with painful memories, and when she mentioned the name Rourke Farron, the crime lord responsible for Sam's death, she felt the pain and anger returning. Cale, who was aware of Farron's reputation, informed her that the man had been killed months ago by Wesley, a personal guard of Arab and Hamill. The news left Celaena stunned, and the memories of that fateful night began to resurface. Cale, noticing the change in Celaena, tried to comfort her, reminding her that she hadn't completely failed Sam, that her survival was in itself a triumph. However, the wound was deep, and as they shared their own stories of loss, both realized how much they carried in their hearts. As they said goodbye, Cale accompanied Celaena to her quarters, where she, in an attempt to offer him comfort, told him that the woman who had left him for Roland was a fool. The gratitude and pain in Cale's eyes reflected the depth of their bond, though both knew that crossing the line between friendship and something more could be dangerous. After Cale left, Celaena, unable to find peace in her room, decided to go to the library. However, upon arriving, she encountered a hooded figure moving with unsettling fluidity. The Eye of Elena, which she carried with her, began to glow intensely, alerting her to the danger. The figure, upon perceiving the amulet, vanished into the darkness without a trace. Terrified, Celaena quickly returned to her room, disturbed by what she had witnessed and by the persistent word that echoed in her mind: plans. Chapter 6. Celaena returned to her chamber in the castle, trying to convince herself that the strange encounter in the hallway had nothing to do with the king. The castle was vast and filled with eccentric characters. Perhaps that shadowy figure was simply a courtier with a strange fondness for books. However, the unease lingered within her, especially because her amulet had glowed in the presence of that creepy figure. Upon reaching her room, Celaena noticed the beginning of a lunar eclipse, adding an eerie atmosphere to the already disturbing night. Determined to seek answers, she pushed aside the tapestry covering the secret entrance and began to descend the ancient stairs that led to the forgotten tomb of Queen Elena. The journey forced her to pass by the place where Cain had summoned the Ridderak and where she had nearly lost her life. The scars on her hand, a result of that battle, reminded her of how close she had come to death. When she reached the door of the tomb, she stopped in front of the bronze knocker shaped like a skull. For a moment, she considered turning back and not going any further, knowing that the answers she might obtain could bring more trouble than she already had. However, her fingers instinctively moved toward the door handle. Then, something surprising happened. The skull spoke. Celaena froze as she heard the voice coming from the inanimate object. Mort, as the knocker called itself, turned out to be an entity enchanted by ancient spells, remnants of an era when magic was powerful and omnipresent. Though the king had banned magic, those ancient spells remained active, immune to his decrees. Mort, with a sarcastic and caustic tone, scolded Celaena for not greeting him or knocking on the door. Intrigued and somewhat irritated, Celaena finally entered the tomb, expecting to find Celaena. But the queen was not there. Mort, in his typical mocking tone, explained that the ancient queen was exhausted from the help she had given Celaena during her fight against Cain and needed time to recover. The tomb was just as she remembered, with the sarcophagi of Gavin and Celaena at the center, surrounded by treasures and ancient weapons. As she observed the sword Maas, legendary for its ability to reveal the truth, Celaena reflected on the burden she felt on her shoulders. Mort, taking up the queen's voice again, conveyed a message to her. Although Cain and the Ridderak had been defeated, they represented only the beginning of a much greater danger threatening Aurelia. Celaena's mission, as the king's champion, was to discover the source of that evil and stop it. Celaena, frustrated and exhausted, questioned why she should accept that responsibility. She didn't believe in destiny and felt that the world was already too broken to save. Her anger flared as she remembered the losses she had suffered, including that of her parents, and she railed against Mort for mentioning them. Furious and hurt, Celaena decided she didn't want to hear any more about Celaena's missions and was ready to leave. Mort, however, tried to make her reflect on her true motivation. Was she there to help others, or only to find answers for herself? But Celaena, tired of the mysteries and responsibilities imposed on her, ignored him and left the tomb, determined to follow her own path. Chapter 7. Celaena woke up before dawn with an unbearable migraine. Seeing the burned-out candle stub on her nightstand, she remembered the strange conversation from the previous night. The existence of a talking door knocker animated by an ancient spell and Celaena's insistence on complicating her life once more made her sigh in resignation. Despite her skepticism, she knew she couldn't ignore the signs. The world was full of dangers, and though she wanted to convince herself that there was nothing she could do to save it, she couldn't stop thinking about the creature she had seen in the hallway. After tossing and turning in bed for a while, she came to a conclusion. She couldn't ignore Celaena's warnings. If she didn't investigate what was happening, she might make a grave mistake. Celaena had only asked her to uncover the king's plans, not to stop them. Moreover, she needed to speak with Archer Finn, an old acquaintance, to make sure he wasn't part of the supposed rebel movement that knew about the king's dark plans. If Archer knew something, she might avoid the hassle of spying on the sovereign and connecting the dots on her own. Determined, Celaena prepared for the day, dressing in her finest clothes before seeking out Cale. It was time to accidentally meet Archer. The streets of Rifthold, though full of snow and mud from the previous day's storm, were as lively as ever. The hustle and bustle of the capital didn't stop for the cold, but Celaena longed for summer. Despite her fur cloak, the cold seeped through every gap, and she appreciated Cale's proximity as they walked down the main avenue. Cale had insisted on accompanying her, though she had asked him to forego his captain's uniform to avoid attracting attention. Their destination was Willow's Tea Salon, where Archer often had lunch. The establishment, exclusive and frequented by Rifthold's elite, brought back memories for Celaena of when, as a younger woman, she visited thanks to her connection with Arabin Hamel. Cale seemed uncomfortable amidst so much ostentation, and Celaena couldn't help but tease him, reminding him that she should handle all the flirting and conversation. Though he grumbled, he finally relented, adopting an air of elegance. When she spotted Archer, Celaena set her plan in motion. Pretending to stumble, she fell into his arms, and Archer's reaction was immediate. He recognized her and called her Lena, a nickname she hadn't heard in years. Archer, as handsome as ever, looked at her with a mix of surprise and delight. They exchanged compliments and smiles as if no time had passed. Archer, with his masculine charm and natural charisma, was still the most beautiful man Celaena had ever met. As they talked, they reminisced about the past, and Archer mentioned Sam and what had happened at Farron's house. Despite the pain those words caused her, Celaena kept her composure and quickly changed the subject, inviting him to dinner the following night. Archer readily accepted, handing her a card with his address. After the encounter, Celaena and Chaol walked in silence through Rifthold's elegant streets. Chaol, however, couldn't stop thinking about Archer and the evident connection between him and Celaena. Though he knew she planned to kill the courtier, he couldn't help feeling a pang of jealousy and anger at how Archer had captivated her with his charm. Finally, Chaol broke the silence, asking about the nickname Lena. Celaena, with a spark of amusement in her eyes, reminded him that she hated it. The light conversation helped ease some of the tension, and Chaol couldn't help but smile, feeling a relief that turned into something deeper when he saw Celaena's smile. As they continued their walk, Chaol couldn't stop thinking about what Celaena had told him about Sam. He had seen the expression of pain on her face when Archer mentioned his name, and though he didn't know all the details of what had happened, he understood that the wound was deep. Walking beside her, Chaol suppressed the urge to take her hand, to offer her comfort, knowing that there were limits he shouldn't cross. But when Celaena smiled, Chaol felt those limits were becoming harder and harder to respect. Chapter 8. Celaena had other plans for the day, but destiny changed when Chaol informed her that she had to attend an official dinner as a guard. Though she could have made up excuses to avoid it, she knew that any unusual behavior could raise suspicions, so she decided to obey the order. After all, if she wanted to fulfill Elena's demands, she had to maintain her image as a loyal subject before the king and the entire empire. The dinner took place in the imposing gala hall, a luxurious space where opulence and power were manifested in every corner. The tables were laden with exquisite delicacies: roasted lamb, glazed duck, and pheasant bathed in sauce. Despite the temptation these dishes represented, Celaena remained firm, controlling her impulse to jump on the table and devour everything in front of her. She positioned herself near a column, dressed in black, camouflaged in the shadows, far from the nobles' chatter and far enough away that her stomach growls couldn't be heard. The hall was full of important figures, from minor nobles to the most powerful members of the court. All attention was focused on the main table, where the king and queen shared the evening with their closest allies, including Duke Parrington, Dorian, and Roland. As Celaena observed the elite of the court, she wondered why the king bothered to attend these events when he could easily excuse himself. However, she didn't expect the monarch to reveal his true intentions before so many people. Chaol, always alert, was also present, closely watching the king, surrounded by the best men he had selected himself. Celaena had tried to warn him how useless and dangerous an attack would be at such a public event, but Chaol, as always, had silenced her with an intense look, asking her not to cause trouble. For Celaena, that concern was unnecessary. She knew it would be suicidal to attempt something so risky in the middle of dinner. When the dinner ended, the king retired along with the queen, and the guests, relieved by their departure, began to relax, chatting among themselves. Dorian, always the center of attention, joined Roland and 3 courtesans, sharing laughs and flirtatious glances. Though Roland seemed to be liked by everyone, Celaena didn't trust him. She felt that his intentions were not entirely clear and feared that Dorian might get involved in something dark. Though she had decided to leave behind any romantic feelings towards him, she still cared about his well-being, feeling a mix of affection and responsibility. Dorian, on his part, couldn't help feeling annoyed by the way Celaena looked at Chaol. During dinner, he had noticed how her expression changed every time she observed him, which only increased his frustration. Finally, unable to bear the situation any longer, he stormed out of the gala hall, wanting to get away from it all. Celaena caught up with him in one of the castle's corridors, noticing his tension. She tried to warn him about his cousin Roland, expressing her doubts about his intentions. However, Dorian, irritated, dismissed her concerns, defending his cousin and reminding her that she herself had manipulated situations in the past. Their conversation grew more tense, culminating in an exchange of reproaches and warnings. In the end, Dorian, still furious, walked away, leaving Celaena alone in the corridor. After this tense encounter, Celaena headed to the dungeons, where she found Celaena Sardothien. The woman who had once been a beautiful lady of the court was now a wreck, with dirty clothes and tangled hair, reflecting her fall from grace. Since the day of the duel, when Celaena had poisoned her, Celaena hadn't seen her again. Celaena had been manipulated by Duke Parrington, and after her failure, she had been imprisoned, with no one yet deciding what to do with her. In that gloomy place, Celaena greeted her, recognizing in her black eyes the spark of what she once was. Chapter 9. Celaena stepped forward, carefully observing the cell where Celaena Sardothien was confined. The prisoner, once a lady of the court, now lived in deplorable conditions, a bucket for her needs, another with dirty water, food scraps, and a pile of moldy hay serving as a bed. It was a miserable environment, one that reflected her fall from grace. However, inside, Celaena couldn't help but feel that it was a just punishment for what Celaena had done. Celaena's voice, once melodious, had become a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible in the cold of the dungeons. With a weak smile full of irony, she asked Celaena if she had come to mock her. But the assassin had another purpose. She crouched near the bars and, in a soft voice, asked about Roland Hivillard, Prince Dorian's cousin. Celaena, with a look of distrust mixed with madness, was cautious, suggesting that Roland was not to be trusted and that there were things about him that could make anyone's stomach turn. Celaena hinted that she could reveal more, but only if Celaena got her out of that cell. Faced with the assassin's refusal, Celaena shrank back in fear, unintentionally showing the abuse marks on her wrists. The sight of those bruises made Celaena feel unexpected pity for her, promising herself to speak with Cale about what she had seen. Before leaving, Celaena let slip a disconcerting comment about crows and headaches, claiming that the sounds of their flapping were driving her crazy. Celaena, though she heard no such sound, understood that the confinement had driven Celaena to the brink of madness. In an unexpected gesture of compassion, Celaena threw her black cloak through the bars, allowing Celaena some warmth in that frigid cell. As she was about to leave, Celaena mentioned that she had been brought to the castle for an unknown purpose, suggesting that she was a pawn in a larger game but could no longer clearly remember the details. Celaena, realizing that the conversation wasn't leading to any useful revelation, said goodbye, leaving behind a Celaena wrapped in the cloak and laughing softly, a sound that followed her long after she left the dungeons. Later, Celaena shared a breakfast in her bed with Nehemia. The snowstorm from the previous night had left a white blanket so thick that running with Cale at dawn had been impossible. As they enjoyed the warmth of the fire and each other's company, Nehemia was outraged to hear about the conditions in which Celaena was being held. Despite her anger, Nehemia was relieved to know that Celaena had already informed Cale, who would ensure that things changed in the dungeons. The conversation soon turned to deeper matters, with Nehemia lamenting how values of honor and loyalty had disappeared in the courts, especially in Adarlan. The princess recalled how in the past, the kingdom of Terrasen had stood out for its integrity and strength, being a real threat to Adarlan's power. Nehemia dreamed of a world where those values could be restored, not only in Terrasen but across the continent. Celaena, though skeptical, couldn't help but reflect on the possibility that those times could return. Finally, Nehemia mentioned that the king had assigned Roland to oversee her, an attempt by the council to control her activities. This only reinforced Celaena's distrust of Roland, though Nehemia seemed more concerned about what it represented for her own mission. After sharing some laughs, the two friends parted ways. Nehemia had matters to attend to, and Celaena, for her part, knew she had to prepare for her next mission, a dinner with Archer that could be crucial in uncovering more secrets about the court and its hidden dangers. Chapter 10. That afternoon, Dorian and Cale, seeking refuge from the intense cold, headed to the castle kennels. The snow was falling incessantly, covering their cloaks and making the prince shiver as they quickly advanced over the dry straw-covered ground. Dorian hated winter, the cold that seeped into his bones, and the dampness that soaked his boots. They had chosen the kennels as an entrance to the castle to avoid Adarlan, Dorian's annoying younger brother, who had returned from school that very morning. Adarlan, who hated animals, would never look for them there. As they moved among the barking and whining, Dorian occasionally stopped to pet his favorite dogs, wishing he could spend the day there to escape the dinner in Adarlan's honor that he would have to attend that night. He complained that his mother had taken Adarlan out of school, though Cale, always pragmatic, suggested that the queen wanted to keep him close in the face of the threat of a possible rebellion. Dorian, remembering the chaos Adarlan had caused with his last gift, feared what his mother might have bought for him this time. Cale, as usual, walked ahead, alert to any possible threat. Dorian, though used to that attitude, still felt it wounded his pride. As they crossed the glass doors into the castle, the warm and decorated foyer offered a cozy contrast to the cold outside. Cale mentioned that Adarlan might have changed in recent months, but Dorian wasn't holding his breath, remembering how the previous summer he had nearly struck his brother. The conversation turned to that night's dinner and the obligation to attend Adarlan's reception. Cale reminded Dorian that they had to attend or face his father's wrath. Dorian, annoyed, suggested that his father could hire Celaena as a watchdog, to which Cale mentioned that she had plans to dine with Archer Finn, something that didn't sit well with the captain. Dorian, visibly irritated, tried to steer the conversation away, assuring that Celaena would dispose of Archer before the month was out. However, the unease in Cale's gaze didn't disappear. For her part, Celaena was preparing for her dinner with Archer. She knew that her red dress, with a plunging neckline and no corset, was provocative, but it was part of her strategy. When she crossed paths with Cale as she left her quarters, the captain couldn't help but gape. Cale, concerned, tried to convince her not to go out like that, warning her about the cold and asking if she was carrying any weapons. Celaena, with a smile, assured him she was armed and that her appearance was part of the game to make Archer believe she was unarmed. The carriage awaited her at the main entrance. Before she got in, Cale stopped her by the shoulder, asking her to be careful. Though Celaena was used to this kind of work, Cale's concern irritated her. She made it clear that she would see him the next day, hinting that the night with Archer might last longer than expected. Cale, visibly affected, let her go, and Celaena promised herself that she would worry about him later. That night, her mind needed to be focused on Archer and getting the information she needed. Archer had chosen an exclusive salon for their meeting, frequented by Rifthold's elite. When Celaena arrived, she made sure that Archer saw her dress from every angle, letting him glimpse the bare back covered in black lace. Archer, seeing her, was impressed and couldn't help but whistle in admiration. During dinner, they exchanged playful remarks and reminisced about old times. Archer, with his natural charm, tried to get close to Celaena, but she, used to dealing with dangerous men, kept her composure, assuring him that she wouldn't fall for his tricks so easily. The dinner continued with light topics, but in Celaena's mind, the plan was clear. When the evening came to an end, they shared Archer's carriage, and he tried to seduce her with a soft kiss on the hand and an invitation to enter his home. However, When Archer confessed that he sometimes hated his life, Celaena realized the bitterness he hid. Seizing the opportunity, she revealed her true mission. The king had sent her to kill him. Chapter 11. Archer, with sharp reflexes honed from his time among assassins, swiftly slid to the other side of the bench in the blink of an eye, pointing a dagger at Celaena that she hadn't noticed before. His chest heaved with labored breaths as he pleaded for his life, even offering money in exchange for mercy. Though a part of Celaena took pride in provoking such a reaction, she raised her hands to show him that she was unarmed at that moment. In a calm voice, she explained that the king suspected him of being part of a rebel movement. Archer let out a bitter laugh, almost a bark, insisting that he was no traitor. But fear began to loosen his tongue, and in his desperation, he offered information about a group gaining influence in Rifthold, aiming to oppose the king's plans. The mention of this group surprised Celaena, especially when Archer mentioned that they were dedicated to restoring the throne of Terrasen to Aelin Galathynius, the lost heir. Celaena's heart stopped for a moment. Aelin Galathynius, the rightful heir of Terrasen, was believed to have been dead for a long time. Archer insisted that these rebels believed she was alive and that she was recruiting an army to challenge the king. This unexpected twist left Celaena torn between disbelief and a dangerous glimmer of hope. If Archer was telling the truth, this information could change everything. However, she maintained her composure and decided to offer him a deal. She would give him a month to get his affairs in order and disappear from the city, but in exchange, Archer would have to provide more information about this supposed rebel movement and the king's plans. If Archer complied, she would fake his death and allow him to start a new life far from Rifthold. Archer, still distrustful but resigned, accepted the deal, promising to send the details of a party the next day, where he could gather more information. Though he seemed relieved by the opportunity to escape, Celaena didn't miss the chance to warn him that if he tried to betray her or flee without fulfilling his part, she would kill him without hesitation. After leaving Archer, Celaena returned to the castle. Despite her exhaustion, she knew she had to speak with Cale. When she arrived at his room, she found him standing by the hearth, clearly nervous. Draped in her ermine cloak, Celaena told him what she had discovered, though she omitted certain details. Cale, serious, asked when she planned to inform the king, to which Celaena replied that she would wait until she had more information. The conversation grew tense when Cale, concerned, asked her to be careful, something Celaena interpreted as doubt about her abilities. The argument escalated until Cale finally admitted that he worried about her because he cared deeply. Celaena, surprised by the sincerity of his confession, could only stammer a response before excusing herself with a smile. Chapter 12. The masquerade ball was held at an elegant estate by the Avery River, where the number of guests was so great that Celaena went unnoticed. Philippa had provided her with a white dress, delicately crafted with layers of chitin and silk in the form of overlapping feathers. A matching mask and ivory feathers adorned her hair, giving her an ethereal and sophisticated appearance. Although she recognized several courtesans, including Madame Clarice, she was grateful that the ball was a costume event, allowing her to remain anonymous. While Celaena presented herself as a swan, Archer Finn was disguised as a wolf, wearing a pewter-colored tunic, gray hose, and black boots. His mask left only his lips exposed, which curled into a wolfish smile as he shook Celaena's hand. Archer, ever charming, commented that while the party was not the best he had attended, Davis's master pastry chef was famous throughout Rifthold. The tables were overflowing with exquisite sweets, almost distracting Celaena from her mission. The conversation between them turned more serious when Archer pointed out Davis, a burly man who seemed to be one of the leaders of the rebel group. Archer, who had noticed a change in Davis's behavior in recent months, suspected that he was involved in something bigger. Celaena, interested in gathering more information, asked to be taken to Davis's office to investigate. Archer led her to a service entrance, ensuring they weren't seen, and guided her down a lonely hallway on the upper floor of the estate. With skill, he picked the lock on the office door, allowing Celaena to access the room. The office was decorated with bookshelves full of books and a large desk in the center. Ever prepared, Celaena ensured her daggers were in place before beginning to search the room. She found nothing out of the ordinary until a book with a word mark on its spine caught her attention. Examining it, she discovered it was full of symbols and words in an unknown language. On the back end paper, someone had written a riddle, "Only through the eye can the truth be seen." The presence of this book in the office of a merchant like Davis deeply unsettled her. As she tried to understand the meaning of the riddle, she heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, she returned the book to its place and prepared for the worst. When Davis entered, Celaena pretended to be crying, inventing a story about a fiancé who had left her. Although Davis didn't seem convinced, he didn't challenge her immediately. However, as Davis approached to escort her out of the office, he tried to stab her. Celaena disarmed him, but couldn't avoid the poisoned blade cutting her arm. The poison, Gloriella, began to take effect quickly, weakening her body as she fought to stay conscious. In a desperate move, she managed to grab the dagger from Davis and slit his throat, leaving the man to bleed out. Barely conscious, Celaena escaped the office and made her way outside. The Gloriella was rapidly weakening her body, but she managed to run to the castle, where the guards recognized her and let her in. With the last of her strength, she headed to a secondary entrance that led to the barracks, hoping no one would see her in her state. Inside the castle, she staggered through the halls until she reached the door to Cale's quarters. When she opened it, she saw Cale, who, upon seeing her covered in blood, rushed to her side. With her last words before losing consciousness, Celaena whispered, "Gloriella," before the world went completely black. Chapter 13. For Cale, that night was the longest of his life. Every second felt like an eternity as he watched Celaena, lying on the floor of his office, covered in so much blood that he couldn't tell where the wounds were. Desperation consumed him as he struggled to locate the injuries beneath the layers of ruffles and pleats in her dress. In a fit of panic, he pulled out his hunting knife and slashed through the fabric, revealing a sheathed stiletto and a small scratch on her forearm, but no more blood. Then he remembered what Celaena had whispered, Gloriella. That poison was known to temporarily paralyze its victims. Cale's nightmare transformed into a series of precise, desperate actions. He quietly called Ress, ordering him to fetch healers and keep everything secret. Then he wrapped Celaena in his cloak to hide the blood, lifted her in his arms, and carried her to his quarters, where he ordered the healers to administer the antidote. He spent endless hours by her side, holding her as she vomited, caring for her, and ensuring that no one else saw her. Unable to leave her side, Cale sent Ress and other guards to investigate in the city. When they returned, they reported that a merchant named Davis had been killed with his own poison dagger. Cale needed no more details to know that he was glad Davis was dead, because if he had survived, Cale would have killed him himself. Celaena slowly awoke, feeling her mouth dry and a sharp pain in her head. Though weak, she could move and recognized her surroundings. She was in her bed, safe. As she turned her head, she saw Cale sleeping in a chair beside her, in an uncomfortable position that revealed his exhaustion. When she whispered his name, Cale immediately woke up, approaching her with a mixture of concern and anger. After ensuring that she was awake and conscious, Cale asked if she had killed Davis because he caught her snooping in his office. Celaena, though nauseated by the memory of the incident, nodded. Cale, still angry, assured her that he wouldn't report it to the king to avoid casting doubt on her ability to spy. However, he warned her that if she ever put her life at risk like that again, he would lock her in the dungeons, not for the murder, but for the mortal scare she had given him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Celaena tried to lighten the moment, but Cale, still tense, explained how terrifying it had been to see her condition when she arrived that night. He told her how the healers had overdosed her with the antidote due to uncertainty about the amount of poison she had ingested, which had left her vomiting for hours. As Celaena listened, she perceived Cale's exhaustion and concern. Though she didn't remember much about how she had gotten to the castle, she knew that in her desperation, she had sought out the safest place she knew. Cale sighed. Chapter 14. Celaena was furious at the thought of how her favorite corner of the castle, the royal library, had become an inhospitable and dangerous place after her encounter with that strange creature. It infuriated her even more that she now needed to be armed to the teeth just to enter there. However, she knew she couldn't let fear dominate her. So, despite feeling a bit ridiculous, she pushed open the massive oak doors of the library, determined to investigate what she had found in Davis's office and to look for possible connections to the Book of Wordmarks and the King's plans. The library was as imposing as ever, with its endless aisles and shelves rising towards the upper levels. The light from the enormous iron chandeliers cast shadows in the vast room, creating a solemn atmosphere. Despite the presence of some scholars and librarians, the place felt desolate, like a castle within a castle. Celaena headed to the table she usually occupied, remembering the hours she had spent there, often in Cale's company. She knew that the library had 3 known levels, full of nooks and crannies, but she wondered if there was more beneath. She recalled a legend Cale had mentioned about a supposed second library hidden in tunnels and catacombs. If there was a creature hidden in the castle, that would be an ideal place to hide. With that idea in mind, she began to explore. As she wandered through the darkened aisles, marking her path with chalk to avoid getting lost, the library grew increasingly silent and oppressive. Minutes, maybe hours, passed, and she finally reached a corner where a solitary tapestry adorned the wall. It didn't depict anything familiar, but was a deep red, almost black, that absorbed the light. When she touched it, she felt a cold draft and discovered another secret entrance. Behind the tapestry, a spiral staircase descended into darkness. The walls were carved with battle scenes, and a channel filled with a viscous substance ran along the wall. Intrigued, Celaena lit the oil in the channel, which illuminated the path with a thin line of fire. With a dagger in hand, she began to descend, observing how the carvings on the walls seemed to move in the light of the flames. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a long paved corridor and a single iron door with no visible lock. The iron, as she well knew, was immune to magic. She wondered if that door was meant to keep something out or to keep something locked inside. When she touched the handle, she felt the amulet of Elena around her neck warm up and emit a flash of light. Uneasy, she knelt and slid her dagger under the door to explore the other side. 2 golden green eyes glowed in the darkness, watching her. Celaena backed away, trying to calm herself. She thought they might belong to an animal, perhaps a rat or a cat, but something inside her told her there was more than it seemed. The iron door concealed a secret, one that she needed to uncover, but not that night. She decided she would return later, better prepared to face whatever might be on the other side. As she made her way back to the surface, she promised herself that she would find a way to open that door and unravel the mysteries hidden deep within the castle. But for now, she just wanted to get out of there and leave behind the shadows that had chased her in the dark. Chapter 15. That night, the ballroom was full. Though Celaena usually preferred the privacy of her quarters, the news that Rena Goldsmith would be performing at the dinner in honor of Prince Holland convinced her to join the long tables at the back, reserved for the lesser nobility and those who avoided the inner circle of the court. From her position, she could barely make out Dorian, but she glimpsed Holland, a pale, chubby boy with black curls. Though she had heard unpleasant rumors about him, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. To her surprise, Cale sat next to her, along with 5 of his men. Though other guards were stationed around the ballroom, those at her table seemed as attentive as those by the doors. Her tablemates were polite, discreetly asking how she was after the events of the previous night. Ress, in particular, seemed genuinely relieved to hear that Celaena was feeling better and soon lightened the mood with a funny story. The conversation revolved around an anecdote in which a guard had been caught in an embarrassing situation. Amid the laughter, Cale and Celaena exchanged jokes, and the captain even challenged her to corroborate his words in the training room. The interaction was light and lively, but it halted when Rena Goldsmith appeared on stage, capturing everyone's attention. Rena was tall and slender, wearing a long green tunic that accentuated her figure, and her reddish hair fell loosely over her shoulders. As she plucked the harp strings, the music filled the ballroom, and a violin joined in a melancholy lament. Rena's voice, soft and ethereal, transported the listeners to a world of legends and lost loves. The room fell into absolute silence, mesmerized by the melody. After several songs, Rena dedicated one in particular to the royal family. It was an old legend about a fae with terrible power, used by kings and lords but always feared and alone. The song told of a knight, initially sent to use her power, who fell in love with her for who she truly was. Celaena, deeply moved, felt tears welling up that she couldn't stop. As she struggled not to break down in tears, she felt Cale's warm hand take hers. When she looked at him, she saw that he understood and returned his smile. Meanwhile, Dorian, sitting next to his brother Holland, barely paid attention to the music. His eyes were fixed on the back table, where he watched as Celaena and Cale looked at each other with an intensity he had never seen in her before. Though he knew nothing had happened between them, he felt that something was changing. Resigned, Dorian decided to let go of his feelings for Celaena, acknowledging that she deserved someone who loved her for who she was and that he deserved the same. Hours later, in the cold and dark dungeons of the castle, the king of Adarlan waited as the guards dragged Rena Goldsmith inside. Blood already covered the block where the body of the decapitated violinist lay. Beside him, Parrington and Roland watched in silence. The guards forced Rena to kneel before the king, who looked at her with coldness before condemning her for singing about magic, an act he considered an affront to the gods and to himself. Rena, with contained rage, raised her chin and, in a final act of defiance, revealed that she had spent 10 years building a reputation that would allow her to enter the castle and sing those forbidden songs. Her goal was to remind the king that, though he had banned magic and killed thousands, the keepers of ancient wisdom had not forgotten. Before she could finish speaking, the king made a gesture, and the executioner raised his axe. As she recited the names of her loved ones who had been killed by the king's regime, the axe fell, silencing Rena Goldsmith's voice forever. Chapter 16. Celaena dug her spoon into the porridge, tasted it, and without much thought, poured a large amount of sugar over it. It was clear that she preferred to have breakfast in the warmth of her quarters rather than venture out into the winter cold. Fleetfoot, her loyal dog, rested on her lap, making it clear that she shared the same preference. With a smile, Celaena commented that the little pet preferred warmth and company. Nehemia, her friend, chuckled softly as she nibbled on a piece of toast. In her native tongue, she mentioned to Celaena that lately, It seemed that only during breakfast could they enjoy her company. Celaena, with an evasive tone, explained that she had been busy, though Nehemia quickly brought up the subject that really concerned her: the task Celaena was performing for the king. The princess looked at her intently and questioned whether it was really worth paying that price in exchange for the freedom she so desperately wanted. Celaena felt the sting of those words, but decided to focus on her plate to avoid Nehemia's accusatory gaze. The conversation grew tense when the princess asked what she would say to her parents about her friendship with the king's champion and how she could justify that relationship. Celaena, defensive, responded that she didn't know Nehemia needed her parents' approval. The confrontation escalated when Nehemia accused her of occupying a position of power and access to crucial information, but only using it to secure her freedom without questioning anything. Celaena, angry, threw her spoon onto the table and turned away, feeling the urge to break everything around her, especially her friend's hurtful gaze. Finally, in a barely audible whisper, Celaena revealed that she hadn't killed anyone. Nehemia, surprised, asked her to repeat it, and the assassin confirmed that all the deaths she had simulated had not actually happened. She had helped the people she was supposed to eliminate escape. Nehemia, still in shock, asked if she was aware that the king would kill her if he found out, to which Celaena simply replied yes. The conversation continued with Nehemia asking about the information Archer Finn was providing, and Celaena told her about the supposed rebel group seeking to restore the throne to the lost heir of Terrasen. However, the princess remained skeptical and asked if she really trusted Archer, given that, as a courtier, he was not someone easy to trust. Celaena, however, was convinced that Archer valued his life above anything else. The conversation shifted when Celaena mentioned something else she needed to show Nehemia, something that put her life in danger: Elena's tomb. Together, they descended into the crypt, where Celaena showed Nehemia the word marks and the encounters she had had with Elena. While they inspected the tomb, Mort, the enchanted door knocker, intervened in the conversation, surprising Nehemia, who couldn't believe what she was seeing. Celaena briefly explained that Mort had been enchanted with ancient word marks and that he was a creation of ancient magic. While Nehemia marveled at the word marks and the mysteries of the tomb, Celaena noticed something strange on the floor: the stars engraved in the marble-formed constellations, including that of the stag, the symbol of Terrasen. Following the constellation's gaze, they found a word mark on the wall, an eye with a hole in the center. Remembering the riddle from the book she had found in Davis's office, Celaena grew excited, thinking she had found the key. However, when she looked through the eye, she saw only a smooth wall and a faint moonlight. Disappointed, she shared her findings with Nehemia, who suggested that it was probably a coincidence. Mort, for his part, offered no useful answers, insisting that Celaena needed to learn to ask the right questions. Despite her frustration, Celaena asked Nehemia to teach her how to interpret the word marks. The princess agreed, and they decided to start lessons the next day, replacing their usual morning walk. After closing the entrance to the tomb, Celaena mentioned to Nehemia the riddle of the eye and the possibility that it was related to the rebel group. Nehemia, however, dismissed it as mere coincidence. Although Celaena wasn't convinced, she decided to trust her friend's wisdom. Later, Philippa entered with a letter from Archer. The contents of the letter included the names of people associated with Davis, which made Celaena feel a bit more optimistic. However, Nehemia was concerned about how lightly Archer had shared that information. Celaena spent the rest of the day spying on the people mentioned in the letter, but found nothing relevant. Upon returning to the castle at dusk, tired and in a foul mood, she found a note from Kale informing her that the king had assigned her to guard duty during the official ball that night. Chapter 17. Cale could sense Celaena's anger without words. He had left her in the courtyard, hidden in the shadow of a column, hoping that the winter cold would calm her down. From his own position in the ballroom, where he could watch both the assassin and the service entrance, Cale kept an eye on the elegant event. The ballroom's decor in shades of white and pale blue created a dreamy winter atmosphere, an ironic contrast to Celaena's mood. In the distance, Dorian fulfilled his duty, dancing with all the ladies who asked him, while his younger brother, Holland, enjoyed the sweets without a care in the world. Holland's behavior worried Cale, as he feared the type of leader he might become, something he didn't dare share with Dorian. Suddenly, Cale realized that Celaena was no longer in her place. Frustrated, he went to look for her, assuming that she had wandered off out of boredom and not because of any real threat. When he found her, he saw her dancing alone under the moon, holding her cloak as if it were a dress and moving to the rhythm of the music that filtered out from the ballroom. Cale was torn between scolding her or laughing, but before he could decide, Celaena noticed him. The two faced each other, and Celaena, in a bitter tone, reproached him for leaving her out in the cold while he listened to the music from inside. Cale, feeling guilty but also intrigued by the vulnerability Celaena was trying to hide, decided to cross a line he had never crossed before. He asked her to dance with him. Celaena, surprised, accepted Cale's hand. Together, they began to move to the rhythm of the waltz, immersing themselves in a moment of deep connection where the world's worries faded away. Neither of them smiled, but both felt that this dance united them in a way they had never experienced before. During the waltz, Celaena realized that, for the first time in a long time, she felt at home. From a window in the ballroom, Dorian watched the scene. He had managed to escape the noise of the ball, but what he saw in the garden left him paralyzed. He knew he should have walked away and pretended he hadn't seen anything, but the connection between his two friends was undeniable and painful for him. At that moment, Nehemia approached him and, with her usual frankness, warned him not to interfere. The princess understood the burden both of them carried, a burden that separated them from the rest, and that neither Cale nor Celaena could understand. Nehemia spoke to Dorian about his father's plans to expand the labor camps, news that Roland, Dorian's cousin, had shared with her. The princess, with her firm conviction, urged Dorian to oppose it, but he felt powerless, knowing that opposing could have serious consequences. Nehemia was undeterred and reminded him of the simplicity of the difference between right and wrong, appealing to Dorian's humanity by mentioning the horrors of Calicula and Endivere. Though the prince tried to justify his inaction, Nehemia's words resonated with an uncomfortable truth. Finally, the princess touched Dorian's chest, tracing a symbol and warning him about a dormant power within him, a power he should not fear when it awakened. With those words, Nehemia left, leaving Dorian reflecting on the meaning of what he had just heard and on the feeling that something deep inside him was beginning to awaken. Chapter 18. Sitting in Archer's parlor, Celaena watched the fire as she tried to distract herself from the memory of the dance with Cale. The previous night had been intense, and she still couldn't understand what it meant. To calm herself, she had accepted some sweets, but not the tea that had been offered to her. The fatigue after the long guard duty and the winter cold had left her exhausted, but now, what occupied her mind most was the confusion about her feelings for the captain of the guard. When Archer finally appeared, his presence disrupted the assassin's tranquility. Despite wanting to freshen up before talking, Celaena ordered him to sit, taking control of the conversation. Archer, though surprised, obeyed, noting the seriousness in her expression. Celaena made it clear that she had no time for more excuses and that she needed more than just a list of names. She wanted to know what those who opposed the king were plotting and what they knew about his plans. Archer tried to buy time, asking for 5 weeks instead of the 3 that remained, but Celaena was firm. He only had 6 days. Desperate, Archer suggested that perhaps Prince Dorian or Cale might have the information she sought, hinting at Celaena's closeness to both. The assassin, annoyed by his insinuation, warned him not to assume he knew them. Before leaving, she threatened him with a much less pleasant visit if she didn't get the necessary information. As Celaena left the house, Dorian was in the council chamber, facing the harsh reality of the slave camps in Calaculla. The maps and figures before him were overwhelming, showing an unbearable number of prisoners. Though the counselors seemed indifferent, Dorian was enraged by the complacency of his father and his cousin Roland, both wearing black rings that aroused suspicion in the prince. Roland proposed expanding Calaculla northward, arguing the need for more space for the slaves, who would not be provided with shelters, forcing them to sleep in the mines. In a fit of indignation, Dorian suggested that some prisoners be released, which earned him a threatening warning from his father. Dorian's fury grew as he remembered Celaena's scars and Nehemia's words about the suffering in those camps. With a rage he could barely control, he confronted his father and the council, declaring his opposition to their plans. After leaving the chamber, he sought out a secluded spot to release his frustration, punching a wall with such force that the stone cracked and a window shattered, all without him suffering the slightest injury. Scared and confused, Dorian realized that something deeper and more dangerous was awakening within him. Meanwhile, Celaena shared a quiet moment with Cale in her room, where they both enjoyed a chocolate cake stolen from the kitchens. Though they tried to keep the conversation light, the assassin couldn't stop thinking about Nehemia's words about a better world and the possibility of rebuilding a court based on honor and loyalty. Celaena realized that she wanted that future, a future where she and Cale could be together in a normal way, far from the terror of the king of Adarlan. After Cale fell asleep, Celaena watched him with tenderness, realizing that her feelings for him were deeper than she had admitted until then. Carefully, she said goodbye and left the room. Returning to her quarters, she encountered Dorian, who seemed troubled and lost. Though he tried to hide it, the assassin noticed that something was wrong with the prince. Despite his attempts to conceal his anguish, Dorian eventually left, leaving Celaena worried and with the feeling that something dark and dangerous was happening, something that even he didn't understand. Chapter 19. Cale stood before the king's throne, delivering a report, but his mind wandered back to the previous night. Celaena's touch had left him in a state of inner turmoil that almost made him lose control. Remembering that moment caused him a mix of emotions he tried to suppress as he focused on his duty. He knew that crossing the barrier separating him from her would endanger his loyalty to the king and his friendship with Dorian. After finishing his report on the security plans for the traveling fair, the king made an unexpected request to closely monitor Princess Nehemia, hinting that there was a threat to her life. Cale, surprised, hid his unease and accepted the order, though the king warned him to keep everything secret, without alerting the princess or anyone else. Cale committed to fulfilling the order, aware that keeping this information from Celaena could have consequences, but he decided to stand firm in his position. Meanwhile, Dorian, after a sleepless night, found himself in the barracks, seeking to vent his frustration in combat. He was troubled by the power he had manifested the day before and wanted to convince himself that it had been just a mistake. After defeating several guards, he encountered his cousin Roland, who tried to apologize for the situation in Calaculla. Roland, apparently sincere, claimed to have suspended the vote on the expansion of the labor camps, giving Dorian a possible opportunity to manipulate the situation in his favor. However, Dorian remained distrustful, aware that he needed to be cautious with everyone, including his own family. Later, in the castle courtyard, Dorian met with Cale and Celaena at the traveling fair, where the extravagance and mystery of the fair contrasted with the cold reality of their worries. Despite the festive atmosphere, the mood turned unsettling when an old witch, known as Baba Yellowlegs, offered to read Celaena's fortune. The assassin, visibly disturbed, refused the offer, showing an unusual fear that surprised both Cale and Dorian. Baba Yellowlegs, with her iron teeth and ominous appearance, left a chilling impression on the group, especially on Celaena, who seemed to recognize the real threat behind the fair's facade. After this encounter, Dorian took Cale to the stables, where he presented him with a special birthday gift, a magnificent black Asterian horse. Cale, though impressed, felt uncomfortable with such a valuable gift, but Dorian insisted that he accept it. As they talked about the gift, Celaena recalled a moment from her past, revealing that she had owned a similar horse, stolen from a lord in Xandria, which surprised and amused the two men. However, the atmosphere soon grew tense again when Celaena, almost unintentionally, confronted Dorian about his feelings, revealing the growing distance between them. After leaving Cale with his new horse, Celaena retreated to her quarters, disturbed by the encounter with Baba Yellowlegs and its implications. Determined to investigate more about the enigma surrounding her, she decided to return to the tomb, convinced that the amulet she wore might be the key to unraveling the mysteries that so troubled her. Without notifying Nehemia, she prepared to face whatever she might find, certain that the time for waiting was over. Chapter 20. Celaena, filled with determination, stood before Mort, the skull-shaped door knocker, demanding answers about the amulet she wore. Mort, with his usual sarcasm, confirmed that the amulet held true power, protecting her from evil, though he offered no further details about its purpose. Frustrated but determined, Celaena entered Elena's tomb and approached the hollow in the wall, attempting to use the amulet to uncover some hidden secret. Despite her efforts, she failed to activate any mechanism or reveal any mystery in the wall. She tried different positions and recited the words engraved on the sarcophagus, but nothing changed. Her frustration grew, and, unable to obtain answers, she left the tomb angry, feeling like a terrible friend for doubting Nehemia and for rushing to solve the enigma alone. Later, in a recurring dream, Celaena found herself on the edge of a cliff, facing a dark abyss that seemed to call her. On the other side, a majestic white stag watched her, inviting her to jump. However, the abyss seemed infinite, filled with a darkness that terrified her. Although the stag approached, Celaena couldn't bring herself to cross, and in the end, the animal retreated into the forest, leaving her alone. Waking in the middle of the night, Celaena was consumed by memories of the day she lost everything she loved. Though her cat, Fleetfoot, was with her, the emptiness in her heart was undeniable. Unable to bear the pressure, she decided to leave the castle before dawn, seeking to escape her own thoughts. Noticing Celaena's absence in the barracks, Cale, uneasy, went to her quarters to find her. There, he found Nehemia, who was sitting, calmly drinking tea and reading. When Cale asked about Celaena, Nehemia handed him a note the assassin had left, explaining that she had taken the day off. Sadly, the princess revealed that the day marked the 10th anniversary of the death of Celaena's parents, suggesting that the young woman was as far from the city as her horse could have taken her. Chapter 21. Cale felt a lump in his throat as he recalled the fury with which Celaena had reacted when Cain had taunted her about her parents' death. Cain had mentioned that Celaena had woken up bathed in blood the day they died, but had never shared more details, and Cale had never dared to ask. Now he knew that Celaena had been only 8 years old when she lost her family. The horrors of that time, when Adarlan had invaded Terrasen and annihilated all who opposed them, still lingered in her mind. What else had the assassin witnessed on that fateful day? Cale, Wanting to understand Celaena's emotional state better, asked Nehemia if the note Celaena had left mentioned anything about her parents. The princess shook her head but hinted that she knew more than she was saying, observing Cale with a calculated serenity. The captain suspected that Nehemia was keeping secrets, possibly related to the threats the king had mentioned, and the idea of being in the dark about these matters deeply unsettled him. When Cale asked when Celaena would return, Nehemia replied that she wouldn't until after midnight, suggesting that she didn't want to spend even a minute of daylight in the castle, the home of the men who had killed her family. With a heavy heart, Cale trained alone that morning, trying to exorcise the tension he felt. Meanwhile, Celaena wandered through the misty hills outside Rifthold, seeking solace in the solitude of the forest. She remembered how, the previous year, she had decided to face her demons in Endivere. She relived the brutal scene in which, consumed by cold, desperate rage, she had massacred several overseers, leaving a trail of blood and vengeance behind. Though she had succeeded in carrying out her mission, the price had been her sanity, laughing maniacally as the guards captured her and threw her back into her nightmare. Later that night, Cale waited in Celaena's antechamber, feeling he needed to be there when she returned. When she finally did, he noticed her exhaustion and the emptiness in her eyes. Without saying a word, he followed her into the bedroom, where he watched her as she prepared for sleep. Seeing her state, Cale decided to stay with her, offering company instead of words that could not ease her pain. Celaena, initially reluctant to accept his presence, eventually welcomed Cale's companionship. As she drew close to him, both felt the intense connection that bound them, a mix of comfort and desire that threatened to break down the barriers they had erected between them. Cale, struggling against his own impulses, embraced her, letting physical contact speak for them. However, when Celaena expressed her confusion about whether she should feel grateful or ashamed for wanting to be with him on such a dark day, Cale was left speechless, surprised by the depth of her feelings. Finally, Celaena broke the tension by heading to the antechamber, where she found a chocolate cake that Cale had brought for her. With a shy smile, she began to eat, while Cale watched her, feeling that, although he couldn't heal her pain, at least he could be by her side in this difficult moment. Chapter 22. The profound silence of the library enveloped Dorian as he pored over old books and genealogical trees, searching for any explanation for his newly discovered magical powers. The worry about his brother Holland gnawed at him, fearing that he too might possess those powers and face the same mortal threat that loomed over Dorian. The prince reflected on how his father, the king, would ruthlessly annihilate anyone who displayed magic, ensuring their complete destruction. Over 3 hours, Dorian found no reference to magic in his lineage, which puzzled him even more. The powers of the Fae and other magical beings had vanished from the continent, and Adarlan, with its military might, had contributed to their disappearance. As he turned the pages, the prince reflected on his family's history, finding few clues about the source of his powers. While reviewing an ancient book detailing the history of the Galathinius family, Dorian was struck by the immense concentration of magic in their lineage. The family, which had ruled with power and respect, had chosen peace over conquest despite their abilities. However, that lineage had been destroyed by Adarlan, and the memory of those who perished had been erased from the records. Dorian wondered what his relationship with Aelin Galathinius, the lost heir of Terrasen, might have been like if she had survived. As he pondered Nehemia's warnings and the strange events surrounding Celaena during the duel with Cain, Dorian felt that there was something more he didn't know, something that was eluding him. He was distracted by the clock striking the hour, reminding him that it was Cale's birthday, and though he hadn't been invited to the dinner Celaena had organized, he thought of congratulating his friend. Suddenly, the temperature in the library dropped, and Dorian felt a cold draft. Books started flying off the shelves as if pulled by an invisible force, and Dorian found himself backing into the wall, stunned by what he was seeing. When it was all over, the prince, his hands trembling, tried desperately to return the books to their places before anyone noticed the chaos. Terrified by the growing magical force he felt within him, Dorian knew he couldn't trust anyone with his secret. Still, the idea of seeking answers led him to think of Baba Yellowlegs, the witch he had met at the fair. Although risky, he thought she might have the answers he so desperately needed. Meanwhile, Celaena was preparing for dinner with Cale, an evening she had been planning for weeks. Though she tried to convince herself that she wasn't nervous, the memory of what had happened the previous night kept her on edge. When she arrived at the hall, she found Cale waiting for her, his expression changing from guarded to warm when he saw her. After a brief exchange, they headed to a secret destination that Celaena had meticulously prepared. They arrived at an old apothecary, and after climbing several flights of stairs, Cale found himself in a greenhouse transformed into an enchanted garden, illuminated by strings of lights. Cale, overwhelmed by the surprise and the beauty of the place, was speechless when he realized that Celaena had recreated a garden inspired by a song they both cherished. The emotion was palpable, and Cale thanked her sincerely, revealing that no one had done something like this for him in a long time. During dinner, they enjoyed several dishes, including Cale's favorite boar stew. The conversation was light and pleasant, but when dinner ended and they stepped onto the balcony, Celaena decided it was time to confess the truth she had been hiding. Nervously, she asked Cale to promise not to get angry, and though he agreed with reservations, his reaction changed dramatically when Celaena revealed that she hadn't killed any of the targets the king had ordered her to eliminate. Instead, she had faked their deaths and helped those people escape. Cale, pale and horrified, stepped back, unable to believe what he had just heard. Chapter 23. The situation grows intense when Cale discovers Celaena's reckless plan. The brave assassin has decided that she will not comply with the king's orders to kill people she considers innocent, something that leaves the captain in a state of desperation. Cale warns her of the danger she's in, knowing that the king, with his network of spies, will surely discover her betrayal, which will inevitably lead to her death, possibly at Cale's own hands. Celaena, dressed in a spectacular outfit that seems to shimmer like stars, faces off with Cale, defending her decision not to be the king's butcher. She argues that the supposed traitors she is meant to kill are people fighting for a better world, not slaves to power. Cale, who deep down shares Celaena's anguish, can't help but fear for her safety. In the midst of the tense argument, Celaena reveals that she has obtained information from Archer about a secret movement in Terrasen. Although Cale despises Archer, Celaena believes she might use that information to negotiate her freedom or at least reduce her time of service as the king's champion. Cale, fearing the loss of her, asks what she'll do once she's free, to which she replies that she'll seek a faraway place where no one knows Adarlan, a place where she can live as a normal person. Cale, devastated by the thought of losing her, promises to accompany her in her quest, even though they both know that could mean betraying his king. At that moment, the feelings between them intensify. Unable to contain himself, Cale pulls her into his arms and kisses her. The kiss transports them to a place where only they exist, in an explosion of passion that leads them to share an intimate night in Celaena's bedchamber. The next morning, they wake up embraced, and as they share caresses and confidences, both are aware of the possible consequences of their relationship. However, they decide to keep it a secret, especially from Dorian, to avoid complications. Cale, worried about what might happen if the king finds out, also faces the reality of his feelings, realizing that his loyalty might be shifting. The chapter ends with a renewed moment of intimacy between the two, as they joke and enjoy their newfound closeness, aware of the challenges the future holds. Chapter 24. Dorian, the Prince of Adarlan, walked among the black tents of the fair, overwhelmed by unease. He had made the difficult decision to seek out Baba Yellowlegs, the witch, to find out if he truly possessed the magical powers he so feared. Though fear paralyzed him, he knew he needed answers. When he finally found the old witch, she was eating calmly in front of her caravan, devouring pieces of chicken with her iron teeth gleaming in the daylight. With cautious words, Dorian approached and offered gold to the witch in exchange for answers. Baba Yellowlegs, a terrifying figure with yellow eyes and a sinister smile, agreed to answer him, making it clear that her services weren't cheap. Throughout the conversation, Dorian learned that magic, as they knew it, had disappeared from the continent, but older and darker powers still remained. However, the witch made it clear that these powers weren't something a young noble like him should investigate. Dorian, pretending indifference, continued to question the witch about the possibility of someone having magical powers in this magicless world. Baba Yellowlegs' answer was blunt. If someone had magic, they would be condemned to death. The witch suggested that if he truly wanted to understand his situation, he should investigate why magic had disappeared in the first place. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Dorian decided to leave, but not before noticing that the witch was watching him in a way that made him feel disturbed. As he walked away, Dorian ran into his cousin Roland, who seemed to have been following him. Roland, with his usual carefree attitude, asked Dorian if he had consulted the witch about his future, to which the prince replied with a lie, that the old woman had predicted great wealth and a glorious destiny for him. Although Dorian tried to appear indifferent, he couldn't help but feel uncomfortable with Roland's presence and the encounter with the sinister Baba Yellowlegs. Meanwhile, Celaena had spent days spying on the men on the king's list, watching from the shadows as they secretly left Rifthold, boarding ships that sailed under the cover of darkness. While Celaena tried to decipher what was happening, Archer, one of the conspirators, appeared beside her, explaining that he had warned those men of the danger they were in, as he couldn't allow their deaths to weigh on his conscience. Celaena, angered by Archer's interference, considered whether it would be easier to kill him and bring his head to the king, but ultimately decided to give him another chance, demanding more information by the next day. As she returned to the castle, Celaena reflected on the complexity of the situation. Though those men were involved in a conspiracy, they also seemed willing to save innocent lives. While she doubted the existence of a secret army in the name of the missing Aelin Galathinius, she couldn't ignore the possibility that forces in Terrasen still remained, willing to fight against the king. With these thoughts in mind, Celaena returned to the castle, where Kale, her recent love, awaited her, and together they immersed themselves in a passionate relationship that occupied all her thoughts. The situation grew more complicated when Nehemia, the princess of Islwy, confided in Celaena that the king had tasked her with convincing the rebel forces to surrender under the threat of a massacre. Nehemia, torn by the responsibility, expressed her desire to free her people from the king's yoke and asked Celaena to join her cause. However, Celaena, fearing the terrible consequences of defying the king, flatly refused to participate in such madness. The argument between the two friends intensified, with Nehemia accusing Celaena of being a coward for not wanting to fight for the greater good, while Celaena insisted that there was no hope against the king's power. The tension culminated when Nehemia, frustrated and hurt, called Celaena a coward to her face. Celaena, furious, stormed out of the room, leaving their relationship at a critical point with an uncertain future. Chapter 25. In the depth of the night, in a tomb illuminated by a moonbeam, the ancient queen and the princess faced a crucial decision. The queen, with the wisdom that only centuries could bestow, warned the princess that for everything to begin, one of the two, the prince or the young woman, must crumble. The princess, aware of the weight of responsibility, admitted with sadness that the prince was not yet ready to bear such a burden. Therefore, the fate of this trial fell on her. The ancient queen, unwavering in her mission, asked the princess if she understood what was being asked of her. The princess, her eyes filled with deep sorrow, nodded. Despite the pain she felt in her heart, she knew she must do what was necessary. She knew that for everything to set in motion, someone had to be emotionally sacrificed. Before leaving, the princess cast one last glance at the queen, a shadow in the threshold of the tomb, and expressed her fear. The young woman would not understand what was being asked of her, and once she crossed that line, it would be impossible to bring her back. The queen, with the certainty of someone who had seen many fates intertwined, assured her that the young woman would find her way back, as she always did. Finally, the princess, with tears struggling to escape, accepted her fate. Hoping that the queen was right, she left the tomb, knowing she had sealed a destiny that would change everything forever. Chapter 26. Cale deeply despised the hunting parties organized by the court. Despite his skill as a warrior, he found himself surrounded by inept nobles who barely knew how to hold a bow, and their clumsiness in the forest was almost painful to watch. To speed up the tedious process, he would discreetly hunt some game and attribute the kills to the clumsy lords. However, that day, with the presence of the king, his son Dorian, Roland, and Duke Parrington, he couldn't afford any furtive maneuvers. As he rode through the trees, Cale found himself lost in thoughts about his family, especially his brother Taran, whom he hadn't seen in years. He wondered if his father had allowed Taran to become one of those superficial nobles, or if he had trained him as a warrior, just as they had with him in the house of Aniel. But his reflections were interrupted when the king approached him, riding his imposing black horse. The king, whose presence always commanded attention, spoke to Cale, hinting that he had noticed the captain's little tricks to make the hunt seem successful for the nobles. Then, in a low and menacing tone, he ordered Cale to arrange a guard for the following night when he would interrogate the princess of Alwi in the council chamber. Although the king didn't specify, Cale immediately understood that he was to prevent Celaena from interfering. Cale, uneasy about the conversation, watched the king as he rode away, followed by his guards. Just then, Dorian appeared beside him and, noticing his friend's disturbance, asked what the king had said. Cale avoided answering truthfully, simply murmuring that it had been nothing important. However, Dorian, with a somber and distant expression, made a request that struck Cale deeply, to treat Celaena well. Before the captain could respond, Dorian walked away, leaving him alone in the forest, burdened with thoughts and worries. That night, though the conversation with the king weighed on his mind, Cale couldn't share what he knew with Celaena. He feared that any revelation could worsen the situation, not just for Nehemia, but also for Celaena and himself. As they lay together, Cale reflected on his loyalty and his love for Celaena, and the immense difficulty of balancing both in such a dangerous environment. Despite the temptation to tell her everything, he convinced himself that it was better to remain silent. At dawn, unable to sleep, Cale silently got up to go to the gardens for some fresh air. Walking among the hedges, he thought about the future, about a life far from Rifthold, about the possibility of marrying Celaena and starting a family. But as he immersed himself in these sweet fantasies, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, someone attacked him from behind, pressing a damp, nauseating cloth against his nose and mouth. Before he could react, everything faded into darkness. Chapter 27. When Celaena woke up, she noticed Cale's absence in bed. Though she appreciated the chance to sleep a little longer, not having to go out for a run, she couldn't help but worry when she found his side of the bed cold, a sign that he had been up for hours fulfilling his duties. She took her time getting up, daydreaming about the day they could be together without interruptions. After bathing and dressing in the clothes she had left in Cale's room, she returned to her quarters. During breakfast, she received a coded list of names from Archer, with more men to spy on. She couldn't help but remember how Archer had betrayed her before and hoped he wouldn't do it again. Nehemia's absence from their morning lesson on word marks didn't surprise her either. Though she missed her friend, it frustrated her to think of Nehemia leading a rebellion. She preferred to stay away until the princess regained her sanity, even if it delayed her plans to use the word marks to open the secret door in the library. After spending the day in Rifthold, spying on the men on the list, Celaena returned to the castle eager to tell Cale what she had discovered. However, Cale didn't show up at dinner. It wasn't unusual for him to be busy, so she dined alone and then curled up on her ottoman to read. But when the clock struck 10 and Cale still hadn't arrived, worry began to take hold of her. She decided to go look for him, thinking he might be waiting for her in his chamber, perhaps asleep. As she walked through the corridors and up the stairs, her worry grew. Cale was a formidable warrior, but the memory of Sam, who had also been skilled and ended up being captured and tortured, haunted her. She quickened her pace until she finally reached Cale's rooms. When she opened the bedroom door, she found a sealed note addressed to her, placed on Cale's sword. The note, carefully designed not to arouse suspicion among the servants, contained a terrifying message. "We have the captain. When you grow tired of following US, come to meet US." The note included the address of a warehouse in the slums of the city and a threat. "You must come alone, or the captain will die before you even step foot in the building. If you have not come by tomorrow morning, we will leave his remains on the banks of the Avery." Cold fury consumed Celaena, tearing down any emotional barriers she had erected since her time in Endeavere. Determined, a plan began to form in her mind with relentless clarity. If they wanted Adarlan's assassin, they would have her. And may the gods help them when she arrived. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Cale was chained to a stone wall, dealing with a throbbing headache and thirst. His attempts to free himself had only earned him more beatings from his captors, a group of hooded and armed men. Though they had beaten and humiliated him, Cale didn't stop showing his defiance, insulting his captors whenever he could. He was becoming increasingly aware that they were waiting for something, or rather, someone. As the day progressed and night approached, Cale realized that his captors had likely kidnapped him to blackmail the king. But his greatest fear was confirmed when he heard one of them mention that she would come. He knew that she could only be Celaena. The thought that they were using her to trap him filled him with fury and fear. However, when one of the captors approached him, warning him that it would be better if he cooperated when the assassin arrived, Cale, despite the situation, smiled disdainfully and warned them that they had no idea who they were dealing with. The captors underestimated Celaena, but Cale knew that when she arrived, everything would change. Chapter 28. Consumed by uncontrollable rage, Celaena stormed through the streets of Rifthold in search of Cale, determined to rescue him from his captors. Her mind focused on three truths. They had taken Cale, she was a lethal weapon, and if Cale was hurt, none of those responsible would leave the warehouse alive. She moved like a shadow, dressed for battle, with Cale's weapons and her own ready to be used. When she reached the slums, hiding under her cloak and hood, she climbed a nearby building to assess the warehouse where Cale was being held. From her vantage point, she observed the guards at the entrance and the distribution of the armed men inside the warehouse. There, chained to a wall, was Cale, visibly injured, his face covered in blood and bruises. The coldness that seized Celaena at that moment propelled her to action. Knowing she couldn't waste time climbing to the roof, she trusted her abilities and took a running leap, jumping directly through an open window on the second floor, landing on the loft. The moment she hit the ground, she threw 2 daggers that took down the nearest archers before they could react. Cale, though weakened by the torture, watched in awe as Celaena moved like a whirlwind of death and destruction. The assassin was an unstoppable force, taking down her enemies with brutal efficiency that left no room for error. The armed men tried to surround her, but she unleashed chaos among them, disposing of her attackers with a skill that made it clear why she was called Adarlan's assassin. The remaining archers didn't dare shoot for fear of hitting their own, allowing Celaena to dominate the situation. One of the hooded men tried to stop the massacre, but Celaena was not willing to listen. When a guard dared to challenge her, she faced him with controlled fury, forcing the leader of the kidnappers to intervene, pleading with her to stop her attack. However, calm and reason had abandoned Celaena, who would not cease until Cale was free. At that moment, Archer appeared on the scene, revealing his involvement in the ambush. Wounded by an arrow, he stepped between Celaena and the men, begging her to listen. The revelation that Archer had been working with Nehemia to lead a movement against the king left her stunned. When Archer insinuated that Cale knew about the threat hanging over Nehemia and hadn't informed her, the betrayal hit her hard. Archer explained that they had captured Cale to learn what kind of questions he would ask Nehemia, but then admitted that they realized he wasn't the interrogator. However, this didn't change what would happen that night, and Archer revealed that his men were already on their way to the castle to try to protect Nehemia, though he feared it was too late. Archer's words filled Celaena with despair. She knew something terrible was about to happen. Without waiting any longer, she turned to Cale, who, with a stricken face, could say nothing. Archer, with sadness in his voice, could only apologize, knowing they had arrived too late. Chapter 29. Celaena sprinted through the streets of Rifthold like a crazed shadow, casting off her cloak and heavier weapons, seeking to gain as much speed as possible to reach the castle before Nehemia could be harmed. Thoughts swirled in her mind, panic growing in her chest, and only the distant sound of a clock marking the hours seemed to accompany her desperate race. The streets were almost deserted, and those few who saw her pass quickly stepped aside, fearful of the fury emanating from her figure. Ignoring the pain in her lungs and legs, Celaena kept running, praying to any god who might listen, begging them to give her the strength and speed she needed to save Nehemia. The crystal towers of the castle loomed before her, shining with a pale, sinister light, and with each step, the fear of arriving too late grew stronger. Determined not to waste time, she avoided the castle's main entrance and headed for a less guarded wall in one of the gardens. She heard hooves behind her but ignored them, focusing only on closing the distance between herself and the place where Nehemia might be in danger. With one last effort, she vaulted the wall, climbing with desperate agility and strength, and landed in the castle garden, ready to run to the princess's quarters. The pain from the wounds she sustained while climbing the wall barely registered in her mind as she ran through the garden toward the glass doors. The snow glistened under the moon, creating a contrast with the darkness that enveloped her thoughts. Adrenaline pushed her forward, ignoring Archer's men and focusing her mind on protecting Nehemia. Nothing else mattered. When she reached the castle doors, she entered without hesitation, aware that every second was crucial. She didn't expect to find Dorian chatting with the guards, but she didn't stop to talk to him. Her priority was to reach Nehemia. The shouts and calls behind her were like a distant echo, insignificant compared to the urgency that consumed her. Celaena took the stairs 3 at a time, her legs trembling with the effort, but she didn't stop. Nehemia's quarters were close, and she clung to the hope of arriving in time. When she finally spotted the wooden door, a wave of relief washed over her. The door was closed, with no signs of being forced open. With daggers in hand, she prepared to protect Nehemia from any threat, convinced she could still save her. She burst through the door, but what she found on the other side left her paralyzed. The room was bathed in blood. In front of the bed, Nehemia's bodyguards lay brutally slain, their bodies mangled and scattered across the floor. But the worst sight was waiting on the bed. Nehemia, her friend, her ally, lay dead, her body savagely mutilated, life cruelly stolen from her. The world stopped for Celaena. The approaching shouts and voices calling her name became a distant murmur. All that existed at that moment was the image of Nehemia, murdered in her bed. Pain and rage mixed within her, forming a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume her. Nehemia was dead, and with her, a part of Celaena was too. Part 2. The Queen's Arrow. Chapter 30. Celaena found herself before a devastating scene. The body of Nehemia, her friend and the Princess of Alwi, lay shattered on the bed, utterly unrecognizable due to the violence with which it had been mutilated. Around her, the room was filled with people reacting in horror to the massacre, but Celaena remained motionless, stunned by the magnitude of the loss. The vitality and hope that Nehemia embodied had been extinguished in an instant, and Celaena was consumed with guilt, realizing that she hadn't been there to protect her. Dorian, the prince, appeared on the scene, his tears contrasting with the cold and distant reality that surrounded Celaena. As she touched the warm tears on Dorian's face, Celaena felt the rawness of her own rage and despair, which began to morph into a need for vengeance. With her vision clouded by anger, her bloodied hand brushed Dorian's neck, but before she could do anything else, a voice called her, bringing her back to reality. Cale, the captain, entered the room, and when his eyes met Celaena's, she saw in him the cause of her pain. Believing he had been complicit in Nehemia's death, her fury erupted, and she launched herself at him, seeking to make him pay for the betrayal. In a brutal confrontation, the two mercilessly beat each other. Though injured, Cale managed to resist Celaena's ferocious attacks as she tried by all means to drive a dagger into his chest. As the battle intensified, the distance between them dangerously closed until a mysterious force seemed to stop Celaena in her tracks, preventing her from delivering the final, deadly blow. At that precise moment, one of Cale's guards, Ress, seized the opportunity to strike Celaena on the head, rendering her unconscious. As she fell, Cale felt something break inside him, aware that the person he had known and loved was lost to the darkness of hatred. Chapter 31. Cale knew he had no other choice when he carried the unconscious and fury-filled Celaena to the castle dungeons. As they descended the stairs to the dark, damp cell, Prince Dorian silently followed, battling the pain of Nehemia's loss and the fear of what he had witnessed. When Cale deposited Celaena in the cell, with Kaltain watching from the adjoining one, his voice was cold as he ordered that she be allowed nothing more than the straw on the floor. Dorian tried to offer his cloak, but Cale refused, distrusting any object that Celaena could use. Cale, still bleeding from the scratches on his face, ensured that Celaena had no access to any weapons. Kaltain, from her corner, watched everything with a disturbing smile as Cale gave precise instructions to the guards before leaving the dungeon, followed by a silent and anguished Dorian. Halfway up the stairs, pain and guilt finally caught up with Cale, who collapsed on one of the steps, burying his head in his hands. Dorian sat beside him, and although their relationship had cooled, he couldn't leave his friend alone at that moment. In a low voice, Cale revealed everything that had happened: the kidnapping, the rebel group that had used him, the king's order to monitor Nehemia and keep Celaena away from the situation. Finally, Dorian understood the magnitude of the tragedy. Nehemia had been murdered, and Celaena had arrived too late to save her. Guilt and horror tormented Cale, who couldn't comprehend how Celaena had been able to run so fast to try to save her friend, and how, despite everything, she had failed. Dorian, knowing that his own magic had intervened in the confrontation between Celaena and Cale, felt a mixture of fear and relief at what had happened. In the darkness of her cell, Celaena awoke, aware of where she was. The cold familiarity of the situation only deepened her bitterness. Reflecting on Nehemia's death, she felt a mix of rage and despair. Keltane, from the neighboring cell, made biting comments, but Celaena, consumed by pain and guilt, could only think of her failure. Cale had known about the danger lurking for Nehemia, but had done nothing to warn her. And now, the hope that Nehemia represented had been cruelly extinguished. In the following days, Celaena was fed meals laced with sedatives that plunged her into a state of oblivion. In her dreams and wakefulness, Nehemia's voice echoed, accusing her of cowardice. Celaena sank into darkness, finding no solace in the food or water offered to her. Finally, on the fourth day, Cale, unable to bear the situation any longer, decided to remove Celaena from the dungeon. With great effort, he carried her in his arms and took her back to her chambers, where Philippa was waiting to help clean and care for the assassin. Cale knew that something had irreparably broken between them. The man who once loved her understood that the Celaena he knew no longer existed, and that she would likely never trust him again. Chapter 32. Celaena woke up in her bed, and with overwhelming fatigue, she knew the water no longer contained sedatives. Around her, the daylight filtered into the bedroom, a light that seemed cruel after the dark days in the dungeon. Fleetfoot, her little dog, was curled up beside her, and when she felt her owner move, she gently licked her before going back to sleep. In that gesture, Celaena wondered if the dog also felt the absence of Nehemia, her beloved friend, and if perhaps she had loved Nehemia more than her own mistress. Nehemia had been a light to everyone, a vibrant and loving soul in a dark world, and now that light had been extinguished forever. Celaena felt an emptiness in her chest, an absurd injustice as she realized her heart still beat while Nehemia's did not. The eye of Elena, the amulet hanging from her neck, emitted a soft warmth as if trying to offer comfort, but Celaena could only let her hand fall onto the mattress, overwhelmed by a paralyzing sadness. Philippa, the maid, tried to get her to eat something and informed her that she had missed Nehemia's funeral. The princess had been buried far from her homeland, while Celaena had been trapped in a nightmare of sedatives and darkness, unable to be there to say goodbye to her friend. The guilt tormented her, but even so, she found no strength to get up. Nehemia's voice echoed in her mind, calling her a coward, and that accusation plunged her further into despair. Day after day, Celaena remained in bed, immobile and broken, unable to face the world without Nehemia's presence. The pain of loss had left her utterly defeated, and the desire to move forward seemed to have completely vanished. Chapter 33. In the stifling mines of Calaculla, a young slave faced relentless heat, a harbinger of the hell it would be to endure the summer there. She had spent 6 months in those mines, a time that surpassed the life expectancy of anyone in that infernal place. Her family had been destroyed by the empire of Adarlan. Her mother, grandmother, and younger brother died shortly after arriving, while her father was brutally killed before he was even sent to the mines. Since then, she had been alone, surrounded by thousands of other prisoners, but in total isolation. Every day in Calaculla was a struggle to keep hope alive. The slave clung to the secret conversations she had overheard as a child when her father and other rebels whispered about Princess Nehemia. The princess was in the capital, conspiring to free her people, and that hope kept her going. She dreamed of the day when she could once again see the skies and fields of Islwey, of the day when she would join the fight against the oppressors, avenging her loved ones. But the reality of the mines was a constant brutality. Every swing of her pickaxe against the rock left her thirstier and more exhausted, while the overseers waited for any opportunity to use the whip. However, something different happened that day. An unease spread through the mines, a silence followed by murmurs and laments that advanced like a wave. The news traveled quickly among the prisoners. Princess Nehemia had died, murdered in Adarlan. The impact of those words left her stunned, unable to fully comprehend what she had heard. As she tried to process the news, the laments around her grew louder, and the overseer, always alert to any disruption, prepared to punish anyone who didn't immediately return to work. But the slave couldn't go on. With the pickaxe still in her hands, she felt the tears, accumulated over 6 months of suffering, finally begin to flow. Nehemia's death marked the end of the hope that had kept her alive, and with a silent determination, she began to recite the names of her dead, those who had fallen under Adarlan's oppression. In a final act of defiance, with a silent scream that rose from the depths of her being, the young woman added her own name to the list of the fallen and, with a decisive movement, drove the pickaxe into the overseer's stomach, ending both his life and her own struggle. Chapter 34. Ress was in the castle's foyer with a grim expression, reporting to Cale about Celaena's recent activities. Since leaving her bed, she had only sat by the fire in silence, barely touching her food and speaking to no one. Cale, who still felt the sting of the scratches on his cheek, knew that these actions were a testament to the chasm that now separated them. Guilt gnawed at him, but he dared not approach her, afraid of the words she might utter. He ordered the guards to continue watching the doors and windows of Celaena's quarters, knowing that if she decided to leave, he needed to be the first to know. But his pain and sense of duty couldn't stop the course of events. The unrest in Islwey and the king's summons to the southern lords, including his own father, demanded all his attention, despite the weight in his heart. Meanwhile, Dorian was growing weary of the constant surveillance. Nehemia's death had exposed the castle's vulnerability, and his family was now under strict protection. However, Roland's presence, his cousin, was an unexpected support. Roland had stayed in Rifthold to back Dorian in council meetings, opposing the deployment of more troops to Islwey and suggesting that Adarlan publicly apologize to Nehemia's parents, which had enraged the king. Dorian, however, was determined to stand firm against his father. In the solitude of his tower, Dorian reflected on the night he had stopped Celaena from killing Cale. Though it hadn't been intentional, he had felt the presence of an unknown power flowing within him, capable of halting Celaena's arm. Now, he was trying to understand and control that magic, but his efforts were in vain. Nehemia's promise to stand by his side when his power manifested had died with her, leaving him alone and without answers. Celaena, for her part, had agreed to sit by the fire only because Philippa had insisted on changing the sheets, an act that made her realize she wanted to erase any trace of Cale from her life. Although Philippa feared that Celaena might take her own life, that thought never crossed her mind. She had a purpose still to fulfill. During those days of pain and silence, Celaena had come to a conclusion. Nehemia's killer had come from outside the castle, and not on the king's orders. Mentally reviewing the crime scene, every detail etched into her memory, she arrived at the terrifying conclusion that only an assassin like Grave, whom she had faced in the tournament, could have committed such a monstrous act. Grave knew the palace and knew exactly the impact Nehemia's death would have on her. Rage began to burn within her, a fire that grew with every second until finally, with unwavering determination, Celaena Sardothien rose from the chair, ready to confront the responsible party. Chapter 35. That night, Celaena quietly prepared for the hunt. Without torches or announcements, she dressed in the darkest robe she could find and stashed a black mask in her pocket. The weapons had been removed from her room, but she knew she didn't need to exit through the main door to carry out her mission. As she opened the secret door, Fleetfoot, her small dog, hid under the bed, whimpering as her mistress ventured into the dark passage. She knew the way to the tomb perfectly, every step and every turn in the castle's depths. When she arrived, the moonlight illuminated Mort's face, the talking door knocker, who offered his condolences for Nehemia, though Celaena did not respond. She moved among the sarcophagi until she reached the hidden treasure. She armed herself with daggers, hunting knives, and the sword Damaris, the sacred weapon of Gavin, the first king of Adarlan. Mort tried to warn her that she would dishonor the sword by using it for her own purposes, but Celaena only smiled, savoring every step that brought her closer to her goal. She then descended into the tunnels beneath the castle and lifted a grate that led her outside, silently slipping into the streets of Rifthold. She knew exactly who she was looking for: Grave, the assassin who had killed Nehemia. With the knight as her ally, she moved through the streets until she reached the vaults, a den where assassins, the depraved, and the cursed gathered. The bartender recognized her immediately, though he dared not oppose her. When she asked for Grave, her voice distorted under the mask, the tension in the place heightened. With a handful of coins and jewels as incentive, she managed to get the information she needed. Grave, for his part, was enjoying a quiet night when everything changed. In an instant, his name was spoken by a ghostly voice, and he realized he was the target of a hunt. He fled desperately, but Celaena pursued him relentlessly until she cornered him in a dead-end alley. He knew he couldn't escape, but he was willing to face her. However, his confidence crumbled when Celaena, with lethal precision, knocked him down and pinned him, stabbing daggers into his wrists and legs, crucifying him against the wall. Grave, now a desperate and bleeding man, tried to resist, but every movement only caused him more pain. Celaena, with terrifying coldness, demanded that he reveal who had hired him to kill Nehemia. Grave tried to feign ignorance, offering gold in exchange for his life, but Celaena showed no mercy. With each refusal, she inflicted more pain until finally, terrified and on the brink of death, Grave relented and begged for his life, promising to tell her everything. Chapter 36. Dorian was on the verge of losing his composure when the doors burst open and Celaena stormed into the room like a whirlwind. The men around the table fell silent, even the king, as they fixed their gaze on what the assassin held in her hand. Cale, stationed by the door, also froze when he saw the severed head she brought with her. It was a macabre scene. The head still bore a look of terror on its face and sparse, dark hair. Celaena, with a defiant smile, advanced toward one of the ministers and tossed the head onto the table, declaring that this belonged to him. The room fell into absolute silence. The king, barely hiding his fury, demanded an explanation. Celaena calmly explained that she had had a chat with Grave, a hired assassin, and that the bracelet she threw on the table, belonging to the late Nehemia, had been recovered from him. She advised the minister to hide his tracks better and hire assassins he didn't know personally. Minister Mullison, frightened and pleading, denied any involvement in Nehemia's murder, but Celaena insisted that Grave had identified him as the culprit. The king, after reviewing a scroll that Celaena had handed over, a list of names of traitors to the crown, congratulated her on her work. The conspiratorial gesture between them was the most terrifying thing Dorian had ever witnessed, feeling that the Celaena he once loved had completely vanished. After leaving the room, Celaena headed to Archer's house, where he tried to apologize when he saw her. She, with a somber air, demanded to know what he and the Resistance were planning and why they had kidnapped Cale. Archer explained that they did it to protect Nehemia, believing her life was in danger from the king. Finally, he admitted that Nehemia was collaborating with the Resistance and that her death had left a void that no one could fill. Celaena, with cold determination, informed him that she had found and killed Nehemia's assassin and that Minister Mullison was now in the dungeons. Before leaving, she warned Archer that he had 5 days to leave Rifthold, or she would personally end his life. Despite Archer's apologies, Celaena, deeply hurt and exhausted, made it clear that there would be no redemption or forgiveness for him. Meanwhile, Cale was facing his father after many years. The meeting was tense, filled with reproaches and distrust. His father, the Lord of Aniel, criticized him for abandoning his inheritance and questioned his loyalty. Cale, however, made it clear that his life was in Rifthold and that he had no intention of returning to Aniel. The conversation grew even more bitter when his father hinted that Cale's relationship with Celaena would only bring him misfortune. Though Cale tried to remain calm, anger overwhelmed him, and before leaving, he warned his father not to interfere in his life or Celaena's. Cale left the meeting feeling trapped, tormented by the family tension and the loss of Celaena, who seemed to have abandoned him both in body and soul. Chapter 37. Celaena found herself alone in the task of gathering Nehemia's belongings while waiting for the arrival of the soldiers and ambassadors from Ailwe. When she opened the door to the room that still bore the pain of death, she noticed it had been cleaned. There was no trace of blood or gore, but the mattress was gone. Standing in the doorway, Celaena debated whether to let the strangers from Ailwe handle the princess's belongings or do the job herself. The thought of unfamiliar hands touching Nehemia's things filled her with indescribable rage and sorrow. She had felt a similar fury earlier that afternoon when she emptied her closet, tearing out dresses, shoes, and ribbons and throwing them into the hallway. The dresses that most reminded her of Nehemia were burned, along with the one she had worn on Cale's birthday night. Philippa, the maid, managed to save some dresses before they were consumed by fire, but Celaena was determined to eliminate any trace of those memories. She ordered Philippa to buy new clothes, and the maid, with sadness, agreed. Carefully, she packed Nehemia's clothes and jewelry, avoiding clinging to the memories each item evoked. The scent of lotus flowers permeated everything, but Celaena continued, sealing each trunk with precision. When she reached Nehemia's desk, still full of books and papers, an old book caught her attention. It was a copy of the book she had seen in Davis's office, with an inscription on the frontispiece that warned, "Do not trust." Next to the warning was a symbol that Celaena recognized as the royal seal. Examining the book, she found another inscription on the back end paper, "Only through the eye can the truth be seen." Nehemia had translated this phrase into several languages, perhaps seeking a clue in other tongues. This led Celaena to question Nehemia's lies. The princess had promised not to keep any more secrets, but it seemed she had hidden much. In a fit of fury and desperation, Celaena ran out of the room, determined to find answers. In the crypt, Mort, the talking door knocker, mocked her, but Celaena paid no attention. She found a second eye on the pommel of Damaris's sword, known as the Sword of Truth. After aligning the pommel with the eye on the wall, she discovered an engraved poem that spoke of 3 powerful objects hidden in different places. This poem referred to a dark WYRD portal and described the location of the objects, one of which seemed to be hidden in a volcano. Celaena realized that Nehemia had been searching for these objects before her death, possibly to get ahead of the king. The revelation that Nehemia knew of the crypt and had been there after the Ridderak attack hit Celaena hard. New lies and secrets were revealed, increasing her frustration and pain. Before leaving the crypt, Celaena decided she had to find those objects before anyone else. Later, she went to the royal mausoleum, under the light of the moon, to pay her respects to Nehemia. Dressed in black and with a veil covering her face, she approached her friend's still unmarked grave. In that lonely place, she began to sing a lament in an ancient language, full of pain and rage. Her song, though broken by emotion, resonated with a wild intensity, as old as the castle stones. When she finished, she felt Cale's presence watching her from afar, but she made no move to approach him. Cale, from a distance, felt guilty and dejected, knowing that his relationship with Celaena was irreparably damaged. Celaena's lament continued to echo in his mind as he walked away, aware that loss and pain now separated them more than ever. Chapter 38. Celaena was in her usual park, watching the cold, gray dawn, with a long stick between her fingers. Beside her, her dog Fleetfoot remained silent, wagging her tail against the dry grass stems. Both of them were looking at the palace in the distance, but Fleetfoot showed none of the usual enthusiasm for playing fetch. She was waiting for someone who would never return. Celaena, lost in thought, threw the stick as far as she could, but when she looked at her faithful companion, she knew that Nehemia's absence still weighed on them both. Meanwhile, Dorian had spent much of the night in the library, desperately searching for a book of magic in the darkest, most forgotten corners. He found nothing, which didn't surprise him too much, but he couldn't help feeling disappointed. He wondered what he would do if he ever found such a book, knowing he couldn't take it to his quarters without the servants finding it. He was lost in thought when he heard footsteps and, as if he had planned the situation, pulled out a book at random and pretended to read it. To his surprise, Celaena appeared, her voice so natural that Dorian nearly dropped the book. Fleetfoot, happy to see the prince, ran to him, covering him with kisses. Although Celaena looked serious and pale, there was a spark of humor in her eyes. The conversation between them was brief and somewhat awkward, but a small exchange about Fleetfoot's literary tastes managed to bring a smile to Celaena's face, one that contrasted with the fierce person he had seen in the council chamber. When Celaena apologized for her recent behavior, Dorian understood that no more needed to be said. He knew that apology was an admission that she had shown a side of herself she usually kept hidden. On the other hand, Cale had also sought refuge in the library, avoiding his father, Celaena, and his men, who seemed to care for him more intently lately. Nonetheless, the library offered him the privacy he needed and perhaps some answers. As he climbed the intricate passages of the library, he caught sight of Celaena and Dorian talking, which brought him a mix of relief and pain. He knew it wasn't his business, but he couldn't help feeling a pang in his heart when he saw them together. Finally, Cale found the chief librarian, Harlan Sensel, who was complaining about a scroll destroyed by a dog, probably Fleetfoot. Holding back laughter, Cale changed the subject and asked the librarian about the funeral chants of other kingdoms, especially Terrasen. Sensel, though puzzled, explained that in Terrasen, these chants were not recorded in writing, but mentioned that at the Terrasen court, they were sung in the language of the Fae, a tradition exclusive to the nobility. This detail chilled Cale's blood, who began to piece together Celaena's true identity. Celaena's parents had not only been murdered, but they also belonged to the nobility of Terrasen, and their brutal deaths had forced her to hide in the only skill that could keep her alive, becoming an assassin. Now, if Celaena ever reclaimed her title and Terrasen rose again, she could become the greatest threat the king of Adarlan had ever faced. This made her not just an enemy but the cornerstone of a possible rebellion against Adarlan. Chapter 39. Crouched on the rooftop of a city house, Celaena watched the neighboring building with a mixture of caution and disinterest. For the last half hour, she had seen several people enter, all hooded, pretending to be customers eager to escape the cold night. However, Celaena knew these weren't just social gatherings. Though she had told Archer that she wanted nothing to do with him or his movement, her presence there showed otherwise. The memory of Nehemia kept her tied to that group, though part of her contemplated the idea of eliminating them all and bringing their heads to the king. A gust of snow passed in front of her, blurring the view of Archer's house. She recognized some of those entering, including the guard who had come between her and Cale in the warehouse. Despite being hooded, his way of moving and the twin swords on his back gave him away. Other faces were unfamiliar to her. As the night wore on, the attendees began to leave, one by one, pretending to be drunk guests. Celaena watched them, noting their movements and directions, but her attention was focused on a tall, heavily armed young man arguing with Archer on the house's threshold. Though the young man showed a vulgar attitude toward Archer, the courtier's unkind smile told Celaena that there was much more at stake than she could see. The next morning, Celaena found herself standing in front of Dorian's door, unsure why she had decided to accept his invitation to dinner. The guards let her pass after thoroughly checking her, and though she knew they would inform Cale, she didn't care. Dorian greeted her with a smile and a joke about his little tower. Despite expecting luxury, the simplicity and disorder of the place surprised her, especially the number of books crammed into every corner. Dorian apologized for the mess, explaining that he preferred to organize things his way. As he moved books and straightened cushions, he asked Celaena why she had decided to visit him. She, not quite sure why, told him the truth. She had no other place to go. Dorian, with a sweetness that broke her heart, assured her she was always welcome in his tower. During dinner, they remained silent, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Celaena spoke when necessary, but the sadness in her eyes was evident. Dorian noticed the change in her, a hesitation that hadn't existed before, a weariness that made her more cautious. After dinner, Celaena fell asleep on Dorian's divan, something that surprised him. He realized that she needed to escape her loneliness and the painful memories that tormented her. The next day, Celaena returned to the tomb, determined to find answers. She spoke with Mort, the talking door knocker, while she examined the sarcophagi in search of clues. Though she had read the riddle tirelessly, she still couldn't understand its meaning or how it related to the rebel movement, Nehemia and Elena. Mort, in his usual sarcastic tone, suggested she consult a seer or oracle. Celaena, not entirely convinced, considered the possibility that other ancient beings might still retain their gifts, like Mort. Though she knew what she was planning wasn't a good idea, a grim smile crossed her face as she thought of the answers she might get. Chapter 40. Celaena stood before the caravans, watching as the fairground workers dismantled their tents. It was the perfect time to blend in with the crowd, unnoticed in her brown cloak, and enjoy a brief anonymity. As she walked among the people, she allowed herself to be carried away by a longing for freedom, imagining what it would be like to travel the world, visiting every possible corner. Determined, she headed for Baba Yellowlegs's black wagon. Though she knew it might be a waste of time, she was willing to ask if the witch could help her decipher the riddle that troubled her. Upon arrival, Baba Yellowlegs was smoking a bone pipe, with an expression that conveyed a mix of curiosity and mockery. When Celaena offered some coins in exchange for answers to her questions, the witch seemed indifferent until she mentioned that Dorian had been there before, asking interesting questions. Celaena's usual calm was replaced by palpable tension. After negotiating the price, she handed over the coins, ensuring the witch kept silent about what Dorian had asked. Distrustful, She followed the old woman inside the wagon, which was crammed with mirrors, papers, and jars filled with strange liquids. Though the situation made her nervous, Celaena remained calm, determined to get the answers she sought. Once inside, the witch began to speak, sharing details about the word keys, legendary objects that, when combined, can open the word gate, allowing access to other worlds and granting unimaginable power. Baba Yellowlegs explained how these objects had been stolen by the Fae to stop the Valg, demons from another realm who had tried to conquer Irelia. The keys, which had been split into 3, were entrusted to Brannon Galathinius, the first king of Terrasen, to be hidden. Celaena listened in silence, horrified by the magnitude of the power these objects granted. The possibility that the king already had one of the keys would explain how he had conquered the continent so easily. With each word the witch spoke, Celaena's mind filled with questions and fears. What if the king already possessed one of those keys? What terrible plans did he have in mind? As the stove's heat made her sweat, Celaena realized she was in greater danger than she had imagined. The tension in the wagon was palpable when Yellowlegs stopped talking and began to move stealthily. When Celaena prepared to leave, something changed in the atmosphere. The witch disappeared among the mirrors, leaving Celaena alone amid her distorted reflections. Celaena knew she had to act quickly. She drew her daggers and began to move cautiously, searching for the exit. But before she could do anything, a chain struck her head with force, knocking her to the ground. The sound of Yellowlegs' hoarse laughter echoed in the darkness as the assassin fell unconscious, trapped in the witch's trap. Chapter 41. From a balcony, Cale and Dorian watched as the fair workers began to dismantle their tents. The fair would leave the next day, allowing Cale to reassign his men to more important tasks, such as ensuring no other assassin entered the castle. Despite everything, his main concern remained Celaena. The night before, after the librarian had left, Cale had returned to the library to examine the genealogical trees of Terrasen. Though he had hoped to find clues, he failed to uncover Celaena's true origin, leaving him frustrated and without answers. Dorian, noticing the tension in Cale, asked him what he intended to do by bringing him there. Cale, trying to hide his concern, asked how Celaena was. Dorian replied that she was trying to overcome the situation but had not mentioned Cale at all. Though the captain wanted to warn Dorian to stay away from her, he knew he couldn't reveal the whole truth. Their conversation shifted to Cale's father's desires, who wanted him to return to Aniel. Dorian, aware of his friend's loyalty, reminded him that he should be cautious with his words and consider to whom he owed his loyalty. However, Cale was increasingly torn between his duty to the crown and his concern for Celaena. Meanwhile, Celaena had been unconscious for only a few seconds, but it was enough time for Baba Yellowlegs to immobilize her and tie her hands with a chain. With her head aching and blood dripping down her neck, Celaena quickly regained consciousness. Not allowing the witch to notice her awakening, she launched an attack, managing to free her hands and confront Yellowlegs. The fight between them was fierce, with Yellowlegs using her speed and chains to try to subdue Celaena. However, the assassin, remembering Arabin's teachings, managed to rid herself of the chains and found an axe amid the chaos of the wagon. Armed, she began to smash the mirrors, eliminating the witch's reflected images until she finally reached her. Though Yellowlegs tried to escape, Celaena was faster, knocking her down with the axe and decapitating her in a decisive act. The witch's blue blood stained everything around, but Celaena knew she had to keep this event secret, especially from Dorian. No one should know what had happened inside that wagon. As she observed the mess she had left, she began to plan how to dispose of the body and the evidence. With determination, her gaze turned toward the stove, considering her next move. Chapter 42. Celaena, After a recent confrontation, headed to the tomb while Mort, the bronze face, watched her with his usual sarcasm. As she entered, he quickly noticed the dark and evil essence emanating from her, a result of her encounter with a witch. Celaena, with visible marks on her skin, asked about the severity of her wounds, and Mort warned her that those scars were more than just cuts. They were a witch's mark. Mort explained that she had killed a queen of a powerful clan and that the other witches of her alliance, the Iron Teeth, would likely seek revenge. As she meditated on the implications of what had happened and the enigmatic verses she had been studying, Celaena realized the situation was more serious than she had imagined. If the king possessed the magical keys mentioned, he could have unimaginable power. Worried, she decided she needed to continue researching in the library, looking for answers and perhaps a spell that would allow her to open a mysterious door. Meanwhile, Cale, tormented by the tension that had grown between him and Celaena, decided to go find her. Not finding her in her quarters, he began to explore her belongings and came across a shocking document, Celaena's will, in which she left all her possessions to him. The date of the will, 2 days before Nehemia's death, took his breath away. Cale realized that, despite everything, Celaena still felt something for him. As he tried to process the situation, Celaena appeared and let him know she had no intention of changing the will. Cale felt overwhelmed when he realized Celaena had thought of his well-being, even in case he lost his job and had to rely on his family. However, he also realized that if Celaena died as a traitor, all her possessions would go to the king. The tension between them became palpable, and finally, Celaena ordered Cale to leave. Cale, as he left, was overcome with emotion. The mix of regrets and the realization of what Celaena meant to him brought him to a breaking point. Unable to contain himself any longer, he hid in a closet and cried with the despair he had repressed for so long. Chapter 43. Celaena, after the tense encounter with Cale, retreated to the recreation room, staring at the piano she hadn't touched in weeks. The recent events, Nehemia's death, and the challenges she faced had kept her away from music. As she brushed her fingers across the keys, she remembered how Nehemia would have supported her during these moments, helping her with the riddles and difficulties that now overwhelmed her. The absence of her friend was an unbearable weight, and though she tried to play, not a single note came out. She let herself be enveloped by the silence and melancholy, acknowledging that the world kept turning without Nehemia, while her heart felt too full of pain to bear another loss. Later, she ventured into the depths of the library, searching for answers to the mysteries that troubled her. The darkness of the library didn't intimidate her. She knew she had to continue investigating, no matter the dangers. She found an ancient book, The Living Dead, which contained a spell to open any door. After memorizing it and practicing, she descended through a series of stairs, entering a spiral of increasingly deep passages. The environment grew more ominous, with numbered iron doors locked on either side of the corridor. The sense of danger increased, but Celaena pressed on, convinced that she was close to discovering something important. Getting closer to the center of the labyrinth, she came across a door that had been shattered from the inside, as if someone or something had escaped with immense force. Upon inspecting the cell, she found crushed bones and claw marks on the walls and door, signs of a violent struggle. These discoveries made her shudder, but she didn't stop. The torch in her hand cast shadows that seemed to move, but Celaena, armed with the sword Damaris, continued her exploration. Finally, after climbing a long spiral staircase, she arrived at a dark chamber with obsidian walls rising to unimaginable heights. This place emanated a malevolent energy, similar to that of the rings she had seen on the king, Parrington, and Kane. When she touched the stone, A shock jolted her, intensifying the migraine she already suffered from. The eye of Celaena, which she carried with her, emitted a faint blue glow before dimming, absorbed by the dark energy of the place. A rumble echoed through the tower, reverberating in the vast darkness, and Celaena, with a whisper full of realization, understood where she was: the clock tower. This place hid dark and dangerous secrets, and she was at the heart of something much larger and more sinister than she had imagined. Chapter 44. Dorian stood before a hidden spiral staircase in the library, which Celaena had discovered while he discreetly followed her. Though he tried to convince himself that he wasn't spying, the truth was that his curiosity had driven him to follow her through ancient passages to this mysterious place. The assassin, with her braided hair, seemed to be preparing for something dangerous, which unsettled him even more. After waiting several minutes, he decided to venture after her. As he descended, Dorian found himself in a dark, dimly lit passage filled with old books and abandoned scrolls. At the end, a slightly ajar door with chalk marks revealed that Celaena was exploring a dangerous area, a place they both needed to leave as soon as possible. With that determination, he continued his descent. Meanwhile, Celaena moved quickly down the stairs, tormented by memories of her duel with Cain and the visions of the dead. She knew that this place, an ancient dungeon, was connected to the king who had built the obsidian clock tower, a cursed stone. She reached a dark passage and extinguished her torch to avoid being discovered, relying on the faint glow of her amulet. As Celaena advanced, a creature, hidden in the shadows, stalked her. This being had been trapped in the catacombs for a long time, forgetting its identity but learning to survive and use the marks that kept the doors locked. Now, with Celaena in its territory, it saw her as prey, ready to hunt. Aware that she wasn't alone, Celaena kept her sword raised, prepared for any attack. The creature, which had learned to hunt in the darkness, lunged at her. A fierce battle ensued, and Celaena managed to drive her sword into the creature's chest, emitting a terrifying scream. Though she wounded the monster, it pursued her with fury, destroying everything in its path. Dorian, who had followed the screams, arrived just in time to see Celaena fighting for her life. They ran together toward the stairs, trying to escape the creature. But the monster caught up with them, and in a desperate act, Dorian used his magic, which he had kept hidden until then, to seal an iron door, giving them a brief respite. However, the creature continued to push with force, threatening to break through the magical barrier. Celaena, injured and exhausted, took a book that Dorian had found in the library, titled The Living Dead, and began reciting a spell to contain the monster. Dorian helped her trace the necessary magical marks, and together they managed to immobilize the creature at the threshold of the door. Seizing the moment, Celaena decapitated the being and ensured it couldn't regenerate. After the battle, they took refuge in Dorian's tower, where they discussed what had happened. Celaena confessed that the creature had been created by the king and that he had likely used one of the word keys to do so. Although she didn't reveal everything she knew, it became clear that the king was involved in something much darker than they had imagined. For his part, Dorian revealed that he had been trying to understand and control his magical power, something he had kept secret until now. Finally, exhausted and injured, they decided to rest and keep watch over the sealed door, aware that the danger was not yet over. Chapter 45. Celaena, still with her body aching from the battle, didn't allow herself the luxury of rest. Instead of visiting a healer or taking a restorative bath, she urgently headed towards the castle dungeons. The memory of Celaena, whispers about being used for a dark purpose, echoed in her mind as she quickly descended the stairs. Upon reaching Caltaine's cell, her heart sank at the sight of it being empty, with only her cloak thrown over the disheveled hay. The thought of Caltaine being taken away filled her with unease. Without wasting time, she asked the guards about the prisoner's whereabouts and was informed that Duke Parrington had taken her to Moreth to marry her. This confirmed Celaena's suspicions about the Duke's dark plans, related to the magical power that pulsed in Caltaine's blood and others like her. As she made her way back to her quarters, a series of unsettling thoughts crossed her mind. She recalled Caltaine's words about the flapping wings she constantly heard, words that aligned with Roland's recent migraines, another noble with magical blood, and the creature she had faced in the library, whose suffering and despair were undeniable. Everything pointed to a dark secret connecting these people with the word keys and the king's power to create monstrosities. The following dawn, after a sleepless night, Celaena found herself again at the sealed door leading to the library catacombs. The portal remained firm, with the WIRD marks still visible and the half-dried blood of the monster she had faced the previous night. She knew that what lay behind that door was so terrifying that no one would believe her if she tried to explain it. Her mind was occupied with the mysteries that remained unsolved. How many word keys did the king possess? What other horrors could he create with them? What plans did he have for beings like Roland and Caltaine, and how did they fit into his sinister game of power? The questions swirled in her head as she tried to open the sealed door, but all her attempts were futile. Finally, she convinced herself that nothing else would cross that threshold, neither in nor out. As she gazed at the dark pool of blood left by the monster, her mind began to work on another puzzle. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket, a fragment of a riddle she had been trying to solve. The phrase, "Alas, the crack of time," caught her attention, reminding her of Elena and Gavin's tomb, where everything seemed to be upside down. Could it be that the answers she sought were hidden in plain sight, disguised as logical sense but actually with a deeper meaning? Convinced that she was on the right track, she decided there was someone or something that could confirm her suspicions and give her the answers she needed. Chapter 46. Celaena arrived panting at Elena's sepulchre, with the sudden revelation that the inscription she had been trying to decipher was actually an anagram. Mort, the talking door knocker, confirmed her suspicion, though he admitted that there were a few extra letters in the riddle. The assassin opened the sepulchre door and entered, guided by the moonlight that illuminated exactly where she should search. Trembling, she ran her fingers over the letters engraved in the stone of the sarcophagus, and upon hearing Mort's enigmatic response, "The cousin I give you," she realized she was before the first word key. With trembling hands, she approached the tiara adorning Elena's figure and began to manipulate the blue jewel at its center. As she did so, she discovered a small hidden compartment. However, to her surprise and horror, she found that the space was empty. This meant that someone, likely the king, had already found and used the key. Mort explained that the king, still young, had found the key before anyone else, and although Mort hadn't understood its importance at the time, now everything made sense. Celaena asked if the king might have the other two keys, but Mort reasoned that if he did, he would have already used their power to conquer other worlds. Despite this, Mort warned that even with just one key, the king had been able to suppress all magic in Aurelia, leaving only his own intact. Celaena felt a growing terror as she realized the implications of this discovery. The word key allowed not only the suppression of magic, but also the creation of monsters like the one she had faced in the catacombs. The pressure and weight of what she had to do overwhelmed her, especially as she remembered Nehemia, who surely knew these secrets. Celaena wished she could speak to her once more, to receive guidance and answers. Despite Mort's warnings, Celaena decided she would attempt to open a portal to another realm, just as Cain had done during their confrontation. If Cain had summoned the Ridderak without a word key, Celaena believed she could use the marks to summon Nehemia, even if only for a moment. The decision was made. She would gather the necessary materials, including the book The Living Dead, and perform the ritual in a larger space, in one of the grand corridors she had explored before. As Celaena prepared for her daring attempt, Dorian was having a strange dream. In it, he found himself in an ancient stone chamber where a crowned warrior with sapphire-colored eyes like his own warned him that the castle and his friend's life were in danger. The warrior, whom Dorian instinctively recognized as Gavin, the first king of Adarlan, urged him to wake up and head to Celaena's quarters. Waking with a clear sense of urgency, Dorian wasted no time. He dressed quickly, grabbed his sword, and rushed to the indicated place, convinced that something terrible was about to happen and that he needed to intervene to save Celaena. Chapter 47. Despite the pain in her injured arm, Celaena continued with her dangerous task. With relentless determination, she plunged her finger into the wound, using her own blood to carefully trace the WYRD symbols on the wall. Every stroke was crucial. Every symbol had to be perfect. She knew she couldn't afford any mistakes if she wanted the spell to work. The blood, imbued with an innate magic, was a necessary ingredient, something that, like Cain, only those with power within them could use. As she completed the arc of symbols, memories of the horrors caused by the WYRD marks assaulted her. She knew this power could corrupt, as it had done with Cain, but it could also grant unimaginable power. With a final symbol, Nehemia's name traced with meticulous precision, Celaena finished the portal. Although the pronunciation of the words in the ancient language made her feel as if her throat were being torn apart, she continued, ignoring the pain and discomfort. When she finally finished reciting the spell, the symbols began to glow with a greenish light, and the wall darkened until it became a total void. Absolute nothingness unfolded before her, a darkness that seemed alive, as if it were watching her from the other side. It was an abyss that extended its tendrils toward her, but Celaena faced it, softly calling out to Nehemia. The response didn't come immediately. The wait seemed endless, and the silence emanating from the portal was deafening. But when finally something began to manifest on the other side, Celaena felt the world stop. Lightfoot, Nehemia's dog, ran towards the portal, wagging her tail enthusiastically, as if recognizing someone. Celaena turned to the portal just in time to see a flickering figure, a figure that, despite its broken light, revealed the unmistakable face of Nehemia. Celaena fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. She apologized, her voice broken by guilt and pain, but Nehemia didn't cross the portal. The princess, with her voice soft but firm, warned her never to open that portal again, that the dangers lurking on the other side were too great. Nehemia explained that she had accepted her fate, that she had chosen her path to alter the course of events. Before disappearing into the darkness, Nehemia left one last message. Celaena was one of the brightest lights in a world of darkness, and she shouldn't let that light go out. Nehemia vanished, and with her, the light. The darkness of the portal remained, cold and impenetrable, leaving Celaena in even greater desolation than before. The words she hadn't been able to say choked in her throat. The plea to return, to not leave her alone, went unanswered. Then, she heard footsteps to her left. It was Archer, who arrived just in time to witness the heartbreaking scene. Seeing the portal, incredulous, he muttered that it wasn't possible, unable to fully comprehend what he had just witnessed. Chapter 48. In an instant, Celaena was on her feet, sword in hand and body tense. Lightfoot, Nehemia's faithful companion, stood beside her, growling at Archer, but keeping a cautious distance. The courtier's presence in that place filled her with suspicion. How had he gotten there? Archer, with dangerous calm, confessed that he had been following her for weeks. Nehemia had shown him the passages before she died, and since then, he had explored them almost every night. The revelation filled Celaena with rage and dread. If Nehemia had asked her not to open the portal, Archer shouldn't see it. Urgently, she approached the wall and tried to erase the WIRD marks she had drawn, but they wouldn't fade. Something was terribly wrong. Archer, seeing her attempts, quickly approached and grabbed her by the wrist, stopping her. The sleeve of his tunic slipped, revealing a black tattoo on his wrist, a snake. Celaena recognized it immediately, remembering the drawing Nehemia had made. That symbol wasn't a mere coincidence, it was a warning. Without wasting time, Celaena stepped back and unsheathed another dagger, pointing at Archer with both weapons. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Nehemia had tried to protect her from Archer, but he had been more involved than Celaena had imagined. Archer, aware that his secret was in danger, begged Celaena to tell him how she had opened the portal. His obsession with the word keys became evident. Upon discovering that Celaena knew about the riddle, Archer revealed that he and his allies had hidden it in Davis's office, hoping she would find and solve it. Archer's obsession was so intense that he was willing to do anything to obtain the power of the keys. Celaena, keeping her composure while panic grew inside her, pretended to agree with Archer. She led him to believe that she shared his desire to use the keys to overthrow the king and create a new world. Confident, Archer revealed his true intentions. He had manipulated everything, from Cale's kidnapping to the anonymous threats against Nehemia. His goal had always been to separate Celaena from those she cared about, ensuring that she trusted only him. When Archer finally let his guard down, Celaena acted. She attacked quickly, but Archer, moving with the speed of an experienced assassin, avoided the fatal blow, ending up wounded in the shoulder. Disarmed and furious, Celaena lunged at him with a roar, ready to end his life. But then, the portal began to emit a guttural growl, and a figure emerged from the abyss. Lightfoot, injured, tried to protect Celaena, but the creature that emerged wasn't Nehemia. Meanwhile, Cale, unable to sleep, was interrupted by a terrified Dorian, who had had a prophetic dream. The prince, visibly shaken, told him that Celaena was in danger. Without wasting time, Cale dressed quickly, and they both headed to Celaena's quarters. Upon arrival, they found a secret entrance that led them to the passages under the castle. Rushing down, Cale and Dorian encountered a nightmare scene, a monster emerging from the portal, a wounded Archer, and Celaena on the ground, protected only by the brave Lightfoot. Without hesitation, Cale ordered Dorian to retreat, but the prince refused. Ignoring the danger, Cale launched himself into the attack, determined to save Celaena from the inhuman creature that loomed over her. Chapter 49. After the first sword strikes, everything became blurry for Celaena. The last clear memory she had was of Lightfoot bravely leaping at the creature. The distraction cost her dearly. The monster grabbed her by the hair and slammed her against the wall, plunging her into darkness. When she awoke, her head throbbed terribly, and the first thing she saw was Cale desperately fighting the demon. Beside her, she felt the cold touch of hands on her neck and, turning, saw Dorian calling her with concern. Despite the pain, she tried to get up. She knew she had to help Cale. Before she could react, she heard the sound of fabric tearing and a scream of pain. Cale had been wounded by the demon's claws. Still dazed, Celaena watched in horror as the monster, with its milky eyes and deformed jaw, lunged again at the captain. Just when it seemed all was lost, Dorian used his magic, throwing the demon against the wall with an invisible blow. Dorian's power, latent and uncontrolled, was stronger than any of them had imagined. The monster, though knocked down, quickly got up, showing its resilience and insatiable hunger. Meanwhile, Celaena heard the footsteps of other beings on the other side of the portal. Archer, who had been chanting until then, fled with the book needed to close the portal, leaving them with no hope of containing the threat. Dorian tried to stop him, but the demon was in the way. As Celaena, injured and weakened, watched her only hope escape, Cale fought to keep the demon at bay. The situation was desperate. Although Dorian tried to convince Celaena to escape and seek help, she didn't want to leave Cale alone. But the pain and exhaustion finally overcame her, and she let Dorian lead her toward the stairs. Cale, knowing he couldn't defeat the demon, knew his only option was to buy time for Celaena and Dorian to escape. But when Lightfoot, injured, was trapped between the demon and the exit, everything changed. Cale didn't hesitate for a second and rushed after her, crossing the portal into the unknown abyss, right behind the little dog. Celaena's scream echoed through the halls as she saw Cale disappear into the darkness. The fear that flooded Celaena at that moment was more intense than anything she had experienced before. Without thinking, she struck Dorian so hard that she knocked him unconscious and ran towards the portal. She couldn't let Cale and Lightfoot stay trapped there. Without stopping, she crossed the portal, determined to bring them back. On the other side, she found Cale protecting Lightfoot with his bare hands, his sword broken at his feet. At that moment, something changed in Celaena. As she crossed the portal, her appearance began to transform. Her face sharpened, her steps became more agile, and her ears took on a slightly pointed shape. The fury and desperation drove her to unleash the monster within. With a burst of blue fire, she threw the demon to the ground. The creature, though wounded, immediately got up, but Celaena, showing long fangs and roaring with inhuman ferocity, stood between the demon and Cale. Cale, watching in astonishment, realized at that moment the truth. Celaena was not human. She belonged to the Fae, a creature with powers and abilities far beyond what he had imagined. Chapter 50. Celaena experienced an abrupt change when intense pain shot through her. She felt her magic, powerful and fierce, overflow, transforming her as the demon attacked. An ancient power was unleashed within her, manifesting as flames, as it had in her past. Every sense sharpened, allowing her to perceive the corruption of the place she was in, but despite the danger, she couldn't leave without first ensuring Cale and Lightfoot's safety. When the demon charged again, Celaena, now fully transformed, faced it. With her senses amplified, she realized the fear Cale felt seeing her, a fear mixed with respect, as the magic burned inside her, ready to explode. Celaena, aware that she couldn't fully control it, begged Cale to escape. However, she didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She launched a blue fire attack, but the demon dodged it, forcing her to use her sacred sword, Damaris, to channel the uncontrolled power. With impressive strength, Celaena drove the sword into the ground, causing the earth at the demon's feet to collapse, creating an abyss between her and the creature. Though the demon tried to escape, the gap widened, leaving it on the edge of the portal as the ground continued to crumble. When she attempted to escape through the portal, the magic struck her again, making her fall to her knees. She lost her supernatural form, returning to being human, and at that moment, Cale dragged her back to Aurelia. Dorian arrived just in time to see Cale cross the portal with Celaena in his arms. Although she was conscious, she was exhausted. Dorian observed the destroyed landscape on the other side of the portal, with the crater and small ledge where there had once been a rocky world. Meanwhile, the portal remained open and Cale, desperate, demanded Celaena close it. She, too weak to do so, turned to Dorian for help. The prince, without hesitation, cut his arm, allowing his blood to serve as ink for Celaena to trace the necessary magical marks to close the portal. As Celaena drew the symbols with Dorian's blood, they both fought against exhaustion. Cale, silently, watched the scene with concern. Finally, the last mark lit up and the portal closed, returning everything to normal. Despite her exhaustion, Celaena couldn't stop thinking about Archer, who had fled through the castle's tunnels. Fury overwhelmed her, replacing her fatigue, and though Cale tried to stop her, Celaena decided that Archer had to pay for what he had done, so she set out to capture him. Chapter 51. As Celaena headed toward the sewer tunnel, she could still sense Archer's trail, as if his presence permeated the air with the fragrance of his cologne and the smell of the blood that soaked him. She furiously remembered how Archer had destroyed everything, ordered Nehemia's assassination, manipulated both of them, and used the princess's death to sow discord between her and Cale, all for revenge and power. Now, Celaena was determined to get her revenge, slowly, until he was reduced to pieces. Upon reaching the tunnel, she heard curses and metallic clanking, confirming that Archer had failed in his attempt to escape. With a smile, she drew her daggers and advanced, ready for the confrontation. However, she was surprised by an attack from behind. Archer had learned well the lessons of assassins, and each of his blows demonstrated his skill and strength. Though Celaena was exhausted, she managed to dodge his attacks, returning each strike with the same determination. As they fought, Archer tried to justify himself, saying he had killed Nehemia to prevent her from destroying them all, and that now, together, they could use the portal's power to overthrow the king. But Celaena wasn't interested in his promises. Archer revealed that Rourke Farron, Sam's torturer, had been one of his clients, unleashing a blind fury in Celaena. When he tried to corner her, she used her knowledge of his movements to strike him with the pommel of her sword, leaving him stunned on the ground. With a dagger at Archer's throat, Celaena considered how to prolong his suffering. However, when he mentioned Nehemia, telling her that she wouldn't want her to kill him, Celaena felt a flicker of doubt. She remembered her friend's words, "Don't let that light go out." Though darkness dominated her inside, there remained a small spark of what once was. Finally, she decided to let him go, ordering him to leave Rifthold that very night, or she would kill him if she found him at dawn. But when Archer, thinking he had manipulated her again, called her a good woman, Celaena stopped. With the calm of a predator, she returned to him and, with a quick movement, plunged her dagger into his heart. Holding him as he died, she whispered in his ear that, although she wasn't good, Nehemia had been. Chapter 52. Cale watched as Archer's lifeless body collapsed to the ground, blood bubbles forming on his lips. The captain, seeing Celaena's cold determination, felt a shiver run down his spine. The assassin closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as if accepting the price of her vengeance. Cale, who had witnessed Archer's plea for his life, understood that those final words had sealed his fate. To alert her of his presence, he scuffed the floor with his foot, but when she opened her eyes and looked at him, the emptiness in her pupils made him hesitate, unsure if she might attack him as well. Over time, the lethal calm that filled her gaze was replaced by deep sadness and exhaustion. She picked up the black book that Archer had dropped, handling it with disdain, as if it were something filthy. Finally, in a subdued voice, Celaena mentioned that she owed him an explanation. Before allowing the healer to treat her, Celaena insisted that they check on Lightfoot's paw, which had suffered a deep cut. Dorian helped as best he could while the healer stitched the dog's wound, and Cale, leaning against the wall, observed in silence. When the healer finished with Lightfoot and Dorian, Cale, after a brief exchange of glances with Celaena, allowed himself to be treated as well. Although the healer maintained a professional expression, the severity of Cale's injuries was evident. As Dorian prepared to leave, Celaena told him she would visit him later in his quarters, creating tension among the three of them. Dorian, suppressing his discomfort, understood that he was being asked to leave, allowing them to be alone. Despite the insistence of the others, Celaena didn't need anyone to heal her. The magic had already healed her wounds, but she was still tormented by a deep exhaustion. After washing up, she put on a clean robe, and as she brushed her hair, Cale entered the room. When she approached the balcony and looked at the stars, she began to tell him about her heritage, revealing that her great-grandmother belonged to the Fae and that she had inherited the ability to transform, a power she lost when magic disappeared 10 years ago. Cale, with a heavy heart, tried to console her, but Celaena distanced herself emotionally, aware that the betrayal she felt separated her from him forever. In the end, she told him that she had to prepare Archer's body to present it to the king, and before Cale could say anything more, she disappeared into the secret passage, taking the sword Damaris with her. Cale was left alone, reflecting on everything Celaena had confessed to him. He realized that she had kept important details hidden, and although he understood her better now, he also knew that the full truth was still out of his reach. As he lost himself in his thoughts, he stroked Lightfoot and decided that he had to do something to protect Celaena. He knew that the information about her nature could condemn her to death if revealed, and he was willing to do anything to keep her safe. With growing determination, Cale went to his father's chamber seeking help. He proposed sending the king's champion to Wenlin to assassinate the royal family, a mission that would keep her away from the danger in Rifthold. His father, surprised by the proposal, agreed, but only in exchange for Cale's return to Aniel. Although this meant giving up his position and probably any future with Celaena, Cale was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure her safety. In the end, with his father's promise, Cale committed to doing whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant never seeing her again. Chapter 53. After telling Dorian the same story she had already shared with Cale, though more briefly, Celaena watched as the prince sighed and collapsed onto the bed, still processing everything he had heard. The situation seemed so incredible that he remarked it felt like something out of a book, to which Celaena, with some bitterness, admitted that she had also started to think she was losing her mind. Dorian, still incredulous, asked if she had really opened a portal to another world using the word marks. She nodded, and though her voice remained calm, inside she knew that portal was just a small part of all that was at stake. Dorian, trying to divert attention from his own dark thoughts, took her hand and, in a gesture of gratitude, gave it a quick kiss, making it clear that despite everything that had changed between them, he would always be grateful to have her in his life. Celaena couldn't help but feel a lump in her throat. Looking at him, she thought of the dream Nehemia had had, a vision of a better world where loyalty and honor prevailed over blind obedience and power. Although that dream seemed to have died with Nehemia, seeing Dorian, an intelligent and kind prince, she wondered if perhaps that dream could still come true. However, a more immediate concern clouded her mind. Did the king know the danger his own son posed? Meanwhile, in the council chamber, the king of Adarlan was impressed by Cale's bold proposal. The plan was as ruthless as it was effective: send the champion to Wenlin to eliminate the king and the crown prince. A mission that would not only weaken Wenlin but also serve as a warning to other enemies. With the border heavily guarded, only the champion, as a woman, could cross without arousing suspicion. The king, intrigued by the idea, summoned Celaena to inform her. Cale explained the mission. She was to travel to Wenlin, assassinate the king and the prince, and gather crucial information about their naval and military defenses. Despite the surprise and tension in the room, Celaena accepted the mission with a cruel smile, though Dorian remained uneasy about the decision. The king, satisfied, ordered Celaena to depart the next day, leaving her little time to prepare. Disturbed by Chaol's plan, Celaena descended to the sepulchre, where she met with Elena, who confirmed that her destiny was Wenlin, though Celaena knew that this mission would endanger everything she had been trying to protect. Elena, with her characteristic mystery, reminded her that leaving the past behind was essential to facing what was to come. Celaena, though resentful of Elena's constant orders, couldn't ignore the weight of her words. Despite her doubts, she finally accepted her fate and prepared for what awaited her in Wenlin, knowing that once she crossed the sea, everything would change. Chapter 54. After the tense council meeting, Chaol tried to avoid confrontation, but he couldn't escape when Dorian stopped him, his voice loaded with anger. The prince, unable to contain his frustration, questioned the decision to send Celaena to Wenlin, pointing out that the mission could destroy the little that remained between them. Chaol, maintaining an impenetrable expression, explained that, considering the power Celaena had demonstrated the previous night, it was best for everyone that she leave the castle. However, he knew he couldn't tell Dorian the truth, who was growing more enraged. The prince, with a threatening tone, warned him that if anything bad happened to Celaena in Wenlin, he would regret having been born. Chaol, silently sharing the same concern, simply replied that someone had to make the tough decisions. Without waiting further, he walked away, leaving Dorian in the room, alone with his rage and doubts. At dawn, before departing, Celaena went to visit Nehemia's grave. The earth, damp and dark after the last winter snows, was ready to receive spring, but Celaena only felt the weight of the farewell and the emptiness of loss. Kneeling at the grave, she let her head fall, and with her voice broken by emotion, confessed everything she had wanted to say to Nehemia. She admitted to being a coward, someone who had fled for too long and had forgotten what it was to face challenges. She promised, with a conviction she hadn't felt before, to stop the king, avenge Nehemia, and free Ailwe. Drawing a dagger, she cut her palm, letting her blood mix with the earth, binding her vow to the sacred ground where her friend rested. With the blood as witness, she swore by her name and life that she would fulfill that promise, no matter the cost, because Nehemia could no longer do so. As she prepared to depart, Celaena knew that this vow would be her only guide from now on. There would be no forgetting or forgiveness. Her purpose was clear, and though she didn't know how she would achieve it, she was determined to see the liberation of Ailwe. It was her time to fight, not just for Nehemia, but for everything she had lost. Chapter 55. Dorian arrived at Celaena's messy bedroom after breakfast, carrying a stack of books. There he found her preparing her luggage, with Lightfoot limping to greet him. Dorian knelt to pet her, while Celaena, without stopping her packing, informed him that the healer had said the dog would recover. Dorian, noticing her travel attire, asked if she planned to leave without saying goodbye, to which she, honestly, admitted that she thought it would be easier that way. Dorian, worried about the suicidal mission she was about to embark on, tried to persuade her, telling her they could find another solution, but Celaena, firm, insisted that everything would be fine. Still, she asked him to take care of Lightfoot while she was away, and Dorian, touched, promised to do so as if she were his own. To ease the tension of the moment, Dorian pointed to a pile of books he had left on the desk, explaining that he had brought them to be safer in his quarters. Although the lie was obvious, Celaena didn't probe further. Dorian, trying to maintain composure, said goodbye, claiming a council meeting, and headed for the door. Before leaving, Celaena stopped him, thanking him for his friendship and promising that she would return for him. Her words held a deeper meaning, and though she said no more, Dorian believed her. The docks were bustling with activity, with fishermen and workers preparing for the ship's departure. Celaena, looking at the ship that would take her on the first leg of her journey to Wenlin, felt the sea breeze and the weight of the mission ahead. Though the pain of the wound in her hand reminded her of the sacrifice she was making, she didn't want to see Cale to avoid the unanswered questions that tormented her. However, as she prepared to board, Cale appeared from the shadows, asking her to wait. When they met, he asked if she understood why he had sent her away, to which she responded with a simple promise: she would return. However, before leaving, she revealed the truth about the word keys and what she had discovered. She handed him Elena's eye, telling him never to take it off, as it would protect him. Cale, overwhelmed by the information and fear, tried to stop her, but Celaena, aware of the little time they had left, simply whispered something in his ear, a truth that would change everything. With a sad smile, she told him that, despite everything, she would always choose him. Before he could respond, she said goodbye with a "forgive me" and headed for the ship. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Celaena looked at Cale, gripping the railing, until he disappeared from view. When the castle of Adarlan became a distant speck and the sea surrounded her completely, Celaena closed her eyes and stopped looking back. With the sea breeze on her face, she turned away, leaving Adarlan behind and setting course for Wenlin, determined to face whatever awaited her. Chapter 56. Cale was baffled by the date Celaena had whispered in his ear before leaving. It was a date that had passed long ago, with no specific year, but the day and month coincided with crucial moments in Celaena's life. The day she was captured and sent to Endivere, the day her parents died. Lost in confusion, Cale lingered at the docks long after the ship carrying Celaena disappeared over the horizon. His thoughts revolved around the hidden meaning of the date and why Celaena had been so enigmatic about it. As he pondered the word keys and the king's dark power, his mind kept returning to that mysterious date, as if something more significant was buried in that enigma. Back at the castle, Cale decided to search for clues in Celaena's quarters. After rummaging through her desk without success, his attention was drawn to some books hidden in a corner, genealogies and chronicles of royalty that he hadn't seen the night before. Among the chronicles, one, in particular, caught his attention, dated 10 years ago. What he read left him cold. King Adarlan Galathynius, along with his nephew Ro and his wife Evelyn, had been murdered. However, the fate of their daughter, Aelin, was uncertain. This discovery led Cale to review the genealogical tree of the royal houses of Adarlan and Terrasen. The mention of Evelyn Ashriver, Aelin's mother, led him to search the records of the Wenlin royal family, where he discovered that Aelin was descended from Mab, one of the powerful Fae queens. This reminded him of Celaena's discomfort upon receiving Diana's arrow, the hunter goddess and embodiment of Mab, during the Yulmas morning. Cale couldn't believe what his trembling hands were reading. Celaena Sardothien not only knew the truth about what happened that tragic night, but she was Aelin Ashriver Galathynius, the rightful heir to the throne of Terrasen. Cale realized that, unknowingly, he had sent the lost queen of Terrasen directly to the land of her most powerful allies. The realization of this overwhelming truth brought him to his knees, aware that Celaena, now Aelin, was the greatest threat to the kingdom of Adarlan and the only hope to destroy the king. Thank you for joining us on this literary journey. If you enjoyed the summary, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing content. Give it a like, share this video with your friends, and leave us your comments. What decision do you think Celaena will make in her struggle between duty and heart? Who is your favorite character in the saga? We'd love to read your responses.